Before the first streetlight ever flickered on, before science had names for the dark, people already knew something was watching from the tree line. Every culture on Earth built a story to explain the thing they couldn't see but could feel, the shape in the fog, the voice that knew your name, the door that shouldn't open at night. Some call it superstition, others call it memory. Tonight, we cross continents and centuries to trace the legends that refused to die. The ones still whispered because no one has ever fully explained them. So sit back, dim the lights, and let's dive in. Winter, somewhere in the forests of northern Europe. The wind moves through bare branches with a sound that older generations swore was not just wind at all. Farmers once bolted their doors before nightfall on certain calendar dates, not out of custom, but out of caution. They called it different names in different places. Odin's Jagd in Germany, Herlething in England, Oskoria in Norway. But the description was almost always the same. A host of riders crossing the night sky, horses screaming, hounds baying, and at the front a figure both ancient and terrible, leading a hunt that was never meant to be seen by the living. This is the legend of the Wild Hunt. Historians can trace written references back over 1,000 years, appearing first in medieval manuscripts and gradually threading through the folklore of nearly every Germanic and Celtic culture in Europe. By the 11th century, chroniclers like the monk who recorded the Peterborough Chronicle described huntsmen black and huge and hideous, riding through the English countryside, their hounds equally black, equally monstrous. The account is treated by historians as one of the earliest surviving written descriptions, but the oral tradition behind it is almost certainly far older. The mainstream explanation is straightforward enough. Storms, migrating geese, whose distant honking can sound eerily like distant hounds and horns on a windless night. Folklore scholars point out that pre-Christian societies often personified natural phenomena they couldn't otherwise explain: wind, thunder, the howling of winter storms, by attaching them to gods and spirits already present in their belief systems. Odin, in Norse tradition, was sometimes cast as the hunt's leader, his role shifting over centuries into figures like Herne the Hunter in English folklore, or even, after Christianization, into darker interpretations involving the restless dead. But why does the legend appear independently across cultures that had little contact with one another? Why do the details, a spectral host, a doomed leader, hounds that mark those who see them for death or misfortune, recur with such consistency from Scandinavia to the Alps to the British Isles? Some folklorists argue this is simply how human pattern recognition works. Give frightened people a strange sound in the dark, and they'll reach for similar explanations because human fear operates the same way regardless of geography. Others are less certain. Comparative mythologists have noted that hunt legends often cluster around the same seasonal points: the depths of winter, particularly around the solstice, suggesting the story may be tied to something deeper than coincidence. A shared human response to the year's darkest, most disorienting nights. Then there are the fringe theories, the ones academic folklorists rarely engage with directly, but that persist nonetheless, that the Wild Hunt preserves a folk memory of something else entirely. Ancient migrations, forgotten wars, even in the more speculative corners of the internet, something not entirely human at all. None of these carry the weight of evidence the seasonal or meteorological explanations do, but they persist for a reason worth sitting with. What's undeniable is this: for over 1,000 years, in places separated by mountains, seas, and centuries, people looked up into a howling winter sky and believed, with total conviction, that something was riding through it. Whatever caused that belief, wind, geese, memory, or something else, it was strong enough to survive the fall of empires, the spread of a new religion, and the slow erosion of oral tradition itself. So what exactly were they hearing? And why, after 1,000 years, do some people in remote corners of Europe still claim to hear it on the coldest nights of the year? If the wild hunt belongs to the forests and frozen skies of the north, its counterpart on the open ocean belongs to sailors, men who spent months at a time with nothing but water in every direction, and who, like the farmers bolting their doors on solstice nights, developed their own vocabulary for the things they couldn't explain. Among those things, one legend outlasted nearly every other maritime superstition: the tale of a ship that could never make port again. Picture the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, sometime in the late 17th or early 18th century. The seas here are among the most treacherous on Earth, the meeting point of two oceans, where warm currents collide with cold, producing rogue waves, sudden squalls, and a kind of fog that can swallow a ship whole in minutes. This was, and remains, one of the most dangerous stretches of water any sailing vessel could attempt to cross. It's also the exact location where, according to legend, a Dutch East India Company captain named Hendrik van der Decken tried to round the Cape during a violent storm and swore, in his fury, that he would make the passage even if it took him until Judgment Day. The sea, as the story goes, took him at his word. The Flying Dutchman is described in most versions of the legend as a ghost ship, perpetually attempting and failing to round the Cape, its crew cursed to sail forever, never reaching land, never dying, never resting. Sailors who claim to see it described a vessel glowing with a strange, pale light, sails full despite there being no wind, moving against the current in defiance of the storm around it. And here is the detail that gave the legend its teeth. To see the Flying Dutchman, according to maritime superstition, was not just eerie, it was a death sentence, an omen that the observer's own ship was doomed. Unlike many folklore legends that fade into vague oral tradition, the Flying Dutchman has something unusual, a documented paper trail. The earliest known written reference appears in a 1795 travelogue, but the story was clearly circulating among sailors well before that, passed by word of mouth across the busiest trade route in the world. By the 19th century, it had become so embedded in maritime culture that even a future king took notice. In 1881, Prince George of Wales, later King George V, recorded in his ship's log that he and several crew members aboard HMS Bacchante witnessed a strange red light, as of a phantom ship all aglow off the coast of Australia. 13 crew members reportedly saw it. The sighting was documented, witnessed by multiple people simultaneously, and logged by a future monarch of England. Shortly afterward, one of the sailors who first spotted the ship fell from the rigging and died. Whether that death was connected to what they saw, or simply a tragic coincidence aboard a dangerous vessel doing dangerous work, is something no one on that ship could ever answer with certainty. The mainstream explanation for sightings like this centers on a real, well-documented phenomenon called Fata Morgana, a complex form of mirage caused by temperature inversions, where layers of warm and cold air bend light in such a way that distant ships, ice formations, or coastlines appear distorted, inverted, or suspended above the horizon, sometimes glowing with an otherworldly light. The Cape of Good Hope, with its collision of cold Atlantic and warmer Indian Ocean currents, produces almost ideal conditions for exactly this kind of optical distortion. A real ship, miles away and normally invisible below the curve of the horizon, could theoretically appear to hover, glow, or seem to sail against the wind, all without violating a single law of physics. But does a mirage explain everything? Fata Morgana requires very specific atmospheric conditions, and while it accounts for isolated sightings, it doesn't fully explain why the legend attached itself so persistently to one exact stretch of ocean, or why sailors across more than 2 centuries from different ships, different nationalities, and different eras of maritime technology, described the same vessel with the same details: full sails and no wind, an eerie glow, and a sense of dread that seemed to precede any rational explanation. Skeptics point out that sailors have always been a superstitious profession. For practical reasons, the ocean genuinely is unpredictable and dangerous, and belief systems that explain sudden disaster often serve a psychological purpose, giving structure to random tragedy. Once a story like the Flying Dutchman entered maritime culture, it's not difficult to imagine confirmation bias doing the rest. A strange light on the horizon, filtered through months of isolation and a well-known legend, becoming something more. And yet, the more speculative corners of maritime lore ask a different question. Why this location specifically, when temperature inversions capable of producing Fata Morgana occur along many coastlines worldwide, most of which never developed their own phantom ship legend? Why did the story persist not for decades but for centuries, surviving the shift from sail to steam, from superstition to scientific literacy, right up through a documented sighting by a future king? Science can explain how a ship might appear to glow and sail against the wind. What it has never fully explained is why, for over 200 years, in one particular stretch of some of the most dangerous water on Earth, so many different witnesses swore they saw the same impossible thing. The ocean keeps its mysteries moving, drifting, glowing, always somewhere out past the horizon. But deep in the forests of Eastern Europe, another kind of mystery stays rooted in one place, waiting. Not on the water, but in the woods. Not a ship, but a hut, one that, according to legend, doesn't stay still either, because it stands on chicken legs and it turns to face whoever dares approach. This is the world of Baba Yaga. If you were a child in Russia, Poland, Ukraine, or any of the surrounding Slavic nations over the past several centuries, you likely grew up knowing her name before you understood exactly what she was. Not quite a witch, not quite a spirit, not entirely evil, and yet never entirely safe. Baba Yaga is one of the oldest and most complex figures in Slavic folklore. An old woman who lives deep in the forest, in a hut that stands on giant chicken legs, surrounded by a fence made of human bones, its gate locked with a human jawbone, its keyhole a mouth lined with teeth. She travels not by foot, but by flying through the air in a large mortar, rowing herself forward with a pestle, sweeping away her tracks with a broom made of silver birch as she goes. The earliest written references to Baba Yaga appear in Russian texts from the 18th century, though most folklorists agree the oral tradition behind her stretches back considerably further, likely rooted in pre-Christian Slavic beliefs, possibly connected to older goddess figures associated with death, winter, and the natural world. Her name itself has resisted easy translation for centuries. Baba is generally understood to mean grandmother, old woman, or midwife in various Slavic languages. Yaga is far murkier. Linguists have connected it to Old Slavic words suggesting horror, illness, or anger, though no consensus has ever been fully reached. Even after hundreds of years of scholarship, we don't entirely agree on what her name means. That alone should tell you something about how deep this figure's roots run. What makes Baba Yaga so unusual, compared to many folklore villains, is that she refuses to be simply good or simply evil. In story after story, collected by 19th century folklorists like Alexander Afanasyev, who compiled hundreds of Russian fairy tales in a project not unlike the Brothers Grimm's work in Germany, Baba Yaga appears as both threat and helper, sometimes within the same tale. She may threaten to eat the children or travelers who stumble onto her hut, and in several stories she does exactly that. But she may also test them, and if they answer her riddles correctly, show proper respect, or complete an impossible task she sets before them, she rewards them with wisdom, magical objects, or safe passage home. She punishes rudeness and arrogance without mercy. She rewards humility and cleverness in equal measure. She is, in essence, the forest itself given a voice and a face, beautiful and fertile to those who respect it, lethal to those who don't. The mainstream academic explanation situates Baba Yaga within a broader European tradition of forest-dwelling folklore figures who personified the genuine dangers of the wilderness. Before modern agriculture and infrastructure, the forest was where people vanished, lost to wolves, exposure, starvation, or simply the disorienting vastness of unmapped land. A story warning children never to stray from the path, never to accept food from strangers, never to disrespect an elder they meet along the way, served a very real protective function. Baba Yaga, in this reading, is less a supernatural entity and more a cultural safeguard, dressed in the imagery of nightmare to make sure the lesson stuck. But folklorists studying her more closely have noticed details that complicate the simple cautionary tale explanation. Her hut, for one, turning to face visitors, standing on legs that let it move, bears a striking resemblance to structures described in some Siberian and Finno-Ugric traditions. Raised storage huts built on stilts or tree stumps, used by hunter-gatherer societies, partly to protect food from animals, and partly, according to some ethnographers, in burial or ancestor-related rituals. Some scholars have proposed that Baba Yaga's hut isn't purely fantastical at all, but a folkloric echo of real funerary architecture, meaning her story may be tangled up not just with fear of the forest, but with something older and more specific: memory of the dead and the structures built to honor or contain them. That theory remains speculative, contested among folklorists and far from settled. But it raises a question the more conventional explanation doesn't fully answer. Why does Baba Yaga so consistently sit at thresholds, the border between the safe world and the forest, between childhood and adulthood, between life and death in the tales where she serves as a gatekeeper to the underworld itself? Why does a figure who is sometimes generous, sometimes murderous, refuse to resolve into a simple monster the way so many other folklore villains eventually do? Perhaps that refusal is the point. Perhaps Baba Yaga was never meant to represent a single fear, but something harder to name: the forest's total indifference to whether you live or die, and the idea that survival depends entirely on how you carry yourself when you meet something older, stranger, and far more powerful than you. Centuries later, her hut still turns in the stories told to children across Eastern Europe. The question folklorists still can't fully answer is what exactly it was built to guard, and what it was guarding against, long before anyone wrote her story down. Baba Yaga's forest lingers behind the trees, patient and ancient, in a landscape that measures time in centuries. But not every threshold guardian belongs to the old world. Some legends grow in newer soil, in places barely a few generations removed from wilderness themselves, and few American landscapes carry that unease quite like a narrow valley just north of New York City, where the Hudson River bends and the hills fold in close enough to swallow the light early each evening. This is Sleepy Hollow. The name itself comes from a real place, a small Dutch settlement in New York's Hudson Valley, first colonized in the 17th century by Dutch farmers, who brought with them not just their language and architecture, but centuries of European folklore about spirits tied to specific haunted stretches of land. When Washington Irving published The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1820, he wasn't inventing the concept of a headless rider from nothing. He was drawing on a tradition of headless horseman folklore that already existed across Northern Europe, particularly in Germany and Ireland, where tales of decapitated riders, sometimes soldiers, sometimes the Dullahan of Irish myth, a death omen who carried his own head beneath his arm, had circulated for generations before ever crossing the Atlantic. Irving's genius was in grounding that old-world folklore in a very specific, very real American setting, and giving it a very specific, very plausible origin story. In the tale, the Horseman is said to be the ghost of a Hessian soldier, a German mercenary fighting for the British during the American Revolution, decapitated by a cannonball during an unnamed battle, doomed to ride through Sleepy Hollow each night searching for his missing head. And here's where the story gets genuinely interesting from a historical standpoint. Hessian soldiers were real. Thousands of them fought in the Hudson Valley region during the Revolutionary War, and archival battle records confirm that cannon fire did cause horrific, often unrecorded casualties among both British and American forces in exactly this area. Irving didn't need to invent a plausible historical backdrop. It was already there, soaked into the ground he was writing about. Local records from the Sleepy Hollow region, predating Irving's story, do reference persistent rumors among Dutch settlers of ghostly riders and unexplained hoofbeats on certain roads at night. The kind of oral tradition that tends to attach itself to places where violence has actually occurred. Whether these rumors were genuinely widespread folklore, Irving simply adapted, or a much smaller local superstition he expanded and popularized into something far larger than it had ever been before, remains a point of some debate among historians of American folklore. What's not in debate is that after 1820, the story took on a life entirely independent of its author, becoming so deeply embedded in American culture that Sleepy Hollow itself, originally named North Tarrytown, officially changed its name to Sleepy Hollow in 1996, a rare case of a real place renaming itself after its own fictional legend. The mainstream explanation for the story's staying power is straightforward. Irving was by any measure a masterful writer, and the tale combines several ingredients that reliably work on the human imagination. A real, atmospheric setting, a genuinely tragic historical backdrop in the Revolutionary War, and a monster with a clear, comprehensible motive, searching for what was taken from him. Unlike many folklore figures whose menace feels random or arbitrary, the Horseman's rage makes a strange kind of sense. He's not hunting out of malice. He's hunting for himself. But local historians and folklore researchers point to something else worth sitting with: the sheer number of reported Headless rider sightings that predate Irving's publication, not just in the Hudson Valley but scattered across colonial-era Dutch and German settlements throughout the American Northeast. If Irving simply invented the story wholesale, why do isolated pockets of oral tradition, recorded independently in different Dutch settlements before 1820, describe strikingly similar figures? Some folklorists argue this reflects nothing more than European immigrants carrying an already common piece of old-world folklore with them and adapting it locally, wherever they settled, the same story with the details filed to fit new geography. Others find the consistency harder to dismiss so easily, particularly given how frequently Headless rider legends specifically attach themselves to sites of real, documented battlefield violence, not just in the Hudson Valley, but across multiple unconnected regions of Europe for centuries beforehand. There's also the matter of the bridge. In Irving's story, the Horseman's power supposedly ends the moment his target crosses a specific bridge out of Sleepy Hollow. A detail folklorists note echoes far older European beliefs that flowing water forms a genuine barrier against certain kinds of spirits, unable to cross onto the other side. Irving may well have simply borrowed that piece of established folklore for narrative convenience. Or he may have been drawing, consciously or not, on a belief system stretching back centuries, one built on some kernel of observation about restless spirits, and the specific places they were and were not believed capable of following someone. Was the Headless Horseman purely Washington Irving's invention, a brilliant writer's synthesis of Old World folklore and New World history? Or did he simply give a name, a face, and a fixed geography to something Dutch settlers had already been hearing hoofbeats for, on certain roads, on certain nights, long before anyone thought to write it down? The Hudson Valley's ghost rides in search of something taken from him, a very American grief, tied to a very specific war. But travel south, past the borders of that story, into the riverbanks and irrigation canals of Mexico and the American Southwest, and you'll find another figure defined entirely by loss, one whose grief is older, and whose sound, according to those who claim to have heard it, is unmistakable even in the dark. A woman crying near the water. Her name is La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, and she may be the single most widely recognized folklore figure across Mexico, much of Central America, and the southwestern United States, told and retold with such consistency across such a vast geographic area that few legends in the Americas can match her reach. The core of the story remains remarkably stable across its countless regional variations. A beautiful woman, sometimes named Maria, falls in love with a man above her station, in some versions a wealthy landowner, in others a Spanish nobleman during the colonial period. They marry or don't. They have children. And then, in a moment of betrayal, jealousy, or abandonment depending on which version you're told, she drowns her own children in a river, in a fit of grief or rage she can never take back. Realizing what she's done, she drowns herself as well, only to find herself denied entry into the afterlife until she recovers her children's souls. She has been searching every night since, along riverbanks and canals, weeping as she goes. Children who hear her crying, the legend warns, should run, because her grief has curdled into something dangerous, and she has been known to mistake the living for what she lost. Unlike the Headless Horseman, which can be traced to a specific author and a specific year, La Llorona's origins are far murkier, and that murkiness is part of what makes her so significant to folklorists. Some of the earliest documented references appear in Spanish colonial records from the 16th and 17th centuries, describing a weeping woman said to wander the streets of Mexico City at night. But many scholars argue the story's true roots run considerably deeper, tangled up with pre-Columbian Aztec traditions that predate Spanish colonization entirely. Aztec accounts recorded by colonial-era chroniclers describe omens witnessed in the years leading up to the Spanish conquest. Among them, a weeping woman heard wandering at night, crying out that her children, sometimes interpreted as her people, were about to be lost forever. If this connection holds, and many folklorists believe it does, La Llorona isn't simply a colonial-era morality tale. She may be one of the rare folklore figures whose origins predate European contact entirely, later reshaped and layered with Spanish Catholic ideas about sin, damnation, and unbaptized souls barred from rest. That layering is itself worth pausing on. As Spanish colonization spread Catholicism throughout Mexico and Central America, older indigenous spirit traditions didn't simply vanish. They merged, adapted, and survived inside new religious frameworks, sometimes deliberately, sometimes as a form of quiet cultural resistance. Folklorists studying La Llorona see in her a kind of living record of that collision, an indigenous omen figure reshaped into a Catholic ghost story, punished specifically for infanticide and denied salvation, concepts that map far more closely onto Spanish colonial religious anxiety than onto pre-Columbian belief systems. In that sense, tracing her story is almost like tracing the region's history itself, one retelling at a time. The mainstream explanation for her staying power echoes something we've seen before in this exploration, that her legend, like Baba Yaga's, functions as a protective warning, specifically aimed at keeping children away from rivers, canals, and other bodies of water where drowning was, and remains, a very real danger. Told with enough conviction, a story about a grieving, dangerous ghost near the water is simply more effective at keeping a child on the bank than a plain warning ever could be. But that explanation, however sound, doesn't fully account for the sheer number of adults across Mexico, Central America, and the American Southwest who report hearing her. Not as children frightened by a bedtime story, but as grown adults, alone at night, near water. Reports of a woman's crying with no visible source near riverbanks and canals persist into the present day, spanning multiple countries and generations, described with striking consistency by witnesses who had no contact with one another. Some researchers who study regional folklore point to this consistency as evidence of a well-transmitted cultural narrative, powerful enough that isolated environmental sounds, wind through reeds, water moving against a bank, distant animal calls, get reliably reinterpreted through an already established cultural lens. Others, less willing to dismiss the pattern so completely, ask why this particular sound, near this particular kind of location, generates such uniquely consistent reports across such an enormous and culturally diverse span of geography. Was La Llorona born from grief, from colonial guilt, from an ancient omen predating the fall of an empire, or from all three, fused together over 5 centuries into a single, grieving voice that still, by so many accounts, can be heard near the water after dark? The story has outlived the empire that helped shape it. What hasn't been answered is why, after 500 years, people still claim to hear her crying. A weeping woman near the water carries her grief south through the Americas, her voice a warning for those who know how to listen. But grief has an older register too, one that crosses the Atlantic back to its source, to the misty stone cottages and windswept countryside of Ireland, where for centuries a very different cry has meant something even more specific. Not a warning to stay away, a warning that it's already too late. This is the Banshee. In Irish folklore, the Banshee, from the Old Irish bean sea, meaning woman of the fairy mound, is not a ghost in the conventional sense nor a monster, nor even, in most tellings, a malevolent spirit at all. She is something closer to a messenger, a supernatural figure whose sole, sorrowful purpose is to announce a death before it happens, wailing outside the home of a family about to lose one of their own. Her cry, described across centuries of oral tradition with remarkable consistency, is not simply loud. It is described as a sound unlike anything produced by a living voice, a keening wail that rises and falls, sorrowful and piercing at once, sometimes compared to the traditional Irish practice of keening, a ritualized form of vocal mourning performed by women at funerals for centuries, blending song, wailing, and lament into a single devastating expression of grief. That connection to keening is not incidental, and it's where the Banshee legend becomes genuinely fascinating from a historical standpoint. Keening, known in Irish as Caoinead, was a real, documented funeral practice across Ireland and parts of Scotland, performed almost exclusively by women, some of whom were specifically hired as professional mourners for their ability to produce an especially affecting, wordless lament. The practice dates back centuries, likely rooted in pre-Christian traditions, and it persisted in rural areas well into the 20th century before gradually fading from common practice. Colonial and church authorities, writing from the 17th century onward, frequently described the sound of a proper keening lament as otherworldly, unsettling, and difficult to listen to, a genuinely unnerving human sound, deliberately cultivated to externalize grief in its rawest form. Many folklorists now believe the Banshee legend and the practice of keening are directly, historically entangled, that the supernatural woman wailing outside a dying man's window may be a folkloric echo of a very real, very human tradition, one where the sound of impending death was, quite literally, a woman's voice raised in mourning before the death had even fully occurred. Written references to banshee-like figures appear in Irish manuscripts dating back to at least the 8th century, though, as with so many of the legends we've explored, the oral tradition almost certainly predates any surviving written record by a significant margin. What's notable about the Banshee, compared to many folklore figures, is how specifically tied to lineage she often was. In numerous traditional accounts, a Banshee wasn't a wandering, indiscriminate spirit attached to a location, the way the Headless Horseman is tied to Sleepy Hollow, or the Flying Dutchman to the Cape of Good Hope. She was frequently described as attached to a specific family bloodline. Particularly, according to some of the oldest tales, families whose surnames began with O or Mac, names indicating direct patrilineal descent in the old Gaelic tradition. In this reading, the Banshee isn't a general omen of death. She's a specific generational guardian of sorrow, following one family's line across generations, appearing only when one of their own is about to die. The mainstream explanation situates the Banshee, much like keening itself, as a cultural mechanism for processing grief and mortality in communities where death, particularly in earlier centuries, was a constant, unpredictable presence. A supernatural warning gives structure to what would otherwise be sudden, senseless loss. And the specific sound attributed to her, that piercing, rising wail, has plausible natural explanations as well. Barn owls, for instance, produce a shrieking call that has been mistaken for a human scream for centuries across multiple cultures. Foxes, too, produce a startling, almost human-sounding cry during mating season, particularly at night. In the rural, sparsely populated Irish countryside, where a sound like that could travel uninterrupted across open fields in total darkness, it's not difficult to imagine how an animal's cry, heard by a family already anxious about a dying relative, might be folded into something much larger and more meaningful than its natural cause. But that explanation, however reasonable, runs into the same difficulty we've encountered throughout this exploration: the sheer number of accounts describing the Banshee's cry as being heard specifically, and only in the moments immediately before a death, rather than randomly, scattered across ordinary nights the way an owl's call or a fox's cry naturally would be. Multiple written accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries describe families reporting the wail on the exact night a relative died unexpectedly, sometimes before news of a death elsewhere had even reached the household through any conventional means. Skeptics point to hindsight bias. The tendency to remember and record the nights a strange sound coincided with tragedy, while forgetting the countless ordinary nights when the same sound meant nothing at all. Believers and even some folklorists studying the tradition more sympathetically ask why, if that bias fully explains it, the association proved specific and consistent enough to survive well over 1,000 years, attached with such precision to individual family lines rather than dissolving into vague, general superstition the way so many other death omens eventually did. Was the Banshee born entirely from grief, given a voice? A cultural practice mistaken over centuries for something supernatural? Or does her persistence, tied so specifically to bloodlines, to timing, to that one unmistakable sound rising across the dark countryside, suggest something in the old stories that hasn't been fully explained away? Families who claim descent from those old lines still speak of her, quietly, and some still say they've heard her. The question that remains is simple and unanswered. What exactly are they hearing? And how does it always seem to know? The Banshee's cry, whatever its true source, is a warning meant to be heard from a distance, grief announcing itself before it arrives. But deep in the boreal forests of the North American subarctic, among the Algonquian-speaking peoples of what is now Canada and the northern United States, there is a different kind of warning, one rooted not in the moment before death, but in the terrifying possibility of what a person might become if they crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed. This is the Wendigo. Among the Algonquian, Ojibwe, Cree, and other First Nations and Native American peoples of the northern forests, the Wendigo is described as a malevolent spirit, sometimes a monster, sometimes a transformed human being, associated specifically with cannibalism, insatiable hunger, and the brutal, unforgiving winters of the subarctic wilderness. Traditional descriptions vary considerably between nations and storytellers, but common threads persist across the region. A gaunt, emaciated figure, unnaturally tall, with skin stretched tight over visible bone, eyes sunk deep into a skull-like face, and an appetite that could never be satisfied no matter how much it consumed. Critically, in most traditional accounts, the Wendigo was not simply a monster from outside. It was, most often, a warning about what could happen to a person from within, specifically someone who resorted to cannibalism, even out of desperate survival necessity during famine, was believed to risk transforming into a Wendigo themselves, their humanity consumed alongside their victim, their hunger growing more monstrous with every person they devoured rather than ever being satisfied. This detail matters enormously for understanding the legend's origins, because the environment that produced it was, historically, brutally unforgiving. The subarctic winters of the regions where Wendigo folklore developed could last many months, with temperatures capable of killing an unprepared person within hours, and historical records confirm that famine, isolation, and starvation were genuine, recurring dangers for communities living across this vast northern territory for centuries. In a landscape where a hunting party could become trapped by an early storm, where food stores could run out weeks before spring, and where the unthinkable, survival cannibalism during starvation, was a real, if rare and deeply taboo, historical possibility, the Wendigo functioned as one of the most powerful cultural prohibitions imaginable. It wasn't simply a scary story told to frighten children. It was a moral and psychological boundary, warning that even in the most extreme circumstances, crossing into cannibalism meant crossing into something that could never fully be undone. What makes the Wendigo particularly significant from a historical and anthropological standpoint is a documented phenomenon that Western psychiatry, beginning in the 19th and 20th centuries, came to label Wendigo psychosis, a controversial and now largely reassessed diagnostic category describing a set of extremely rare cases in which individuals, primarily within Algonquian communities, reportedly developed intense cravings for human flesh alongside a genuine, terrified belief that they were transforming into a Wendigo themselves. The most extensively documented case involves a Cree trapper named Swift Runner, tried and executed in Canada in 1879 after killing and consuming members of his own family during a winter of severe isolation, an incident that entered both legal and anthropological records in considerable, if disturbing, detail. Cases like Swift Runner's were, for decades, cited by outside anthropologists as evidence of a culturally specific psychiatric condition unique to communities with Wendigo belief systems. More recent scholarship, however, including work by Indigenous scholars and researchers revisiting this history, has pushed back substantially against the framing of Wendigo psychosis as a discrete, well-documented psychiatric phenomenon at all. Critics point out that many of the historical cases were recorded by outside missionaries, colonial officials, and early anthropologists working with limited cultural understanding, incomplete records, and, in some cases, clear incentive to frame indigenous communities and belief systems as primitive or pathological. Some researchers now argue that extreme isolation, genuine starvation, and profound psychological distress are sufficient to explain documented cases without requiring a culturally exclusive diagnostic category at all. That what happened to individuals like Swift Runner reflects the universal human breaking point under extraordinary conditions, filtered through the specific spiritual framework available to interpret it, rather than a spirit or a distinct mental illness unique to Wendigo belief systems. That reassessment matters, and it's worth sitting with rather than glossing over, because it touches on how outside observers have historically treated indigenous spiritual traditions, sometimes with genuine anthropological curiosity, but often filtered through assumptions that shaped the historical record more than the original belief systems themselves ever intended. What remains, stripped of colonial-era sensationalism, is a legend that Algonquian and related peoples have carried for centuries, one specifically designed to police the most extreme possible violation a person could commit against their own community, in an environment where survival sometimes hung on a matter of weeks, or days, or a single failed hunt. Was the Wendigo simply a moral warning, a spiritual boundary drawn around humanity's worst possible failure, given form by people who understood better than almost anyone what winter could demand of a person? Or does its persistence, across centuries, across dozens of related but distinct nations, each independently describing a strikingly similar hollow-eyed, insatiable figure, suggest the legend was pointing at something its original storytellers understood more precisely than outsiders, then or now, have ever fully grasped? The forests where the Wendigo is said to walk are still there, still capable of the same brutal winters that shaped the legend in the first place. What hasn't been settled, even now, is exactly what those winters revealed about the line between hunger and something else entirely. The Wendigo's forests demand a reckoning with hunger and survival, ancient and elemental. But not every American monster legend needs centuries of wilderness or pre-colonial roots to take hold. Sometimes, all it takes is one strange birth, one furious mother's curse, and 13 children too many, at least according to the story that's haunted a stretch of dense, sandy woodland in southern New Jersey for nearly 300 years. Welcome to the Pine Barrens. The Pine Barrens are real, and they are genuinely strange terrain by American standards. Over 1 million acres of pitch pine forest, cedar swamp, and sandy acidic soil stretching across southern New Jersey, sparsely populated even today. Historically home to scattered communities of charcoal burners, glassmakers, and ironworkers who lived largely isolated from the more developed coastal towns nearby. It's exactly the kind of landscape that tends to generate folklore, dense enough to disorient, remote enough that a strange sound or shape glimpsed at dusk could travel through oral tradition unchallenged for generations. And for nearly 300 years, that landscape has been home to one of America's most enduring cryptid legends, the Jersey Devil. The most commonly told origin story dates back to 1735, centered on a Pine Barrens resident referred to in most versions simply as Mother Leeds. According to the legend, Leeds was pregnant with her 13th child, and exhausted and overwhelmed by the prospect of another mouth to feed, reportedly cried out during labor that the child could be the devil himself. What followed, according to the tale, was a birth unlike any other, a child that emerged seemingly normal before rapidly transforming, sprouting wings, hooves, a horse-like head, and a forked tail, before shrieking and flying up through the chimney into the surrounding pines, never to be fully banished from the area again. Some versions of the story identify the family more specifically as the real historical Leeds family, prominent landowners in the region during the colonial period, a detail that has led some local historians to speculate the legend may have originated, at least in part, from a genuine family feud or political rivalry. deliberately weaponized as an insult against a real family's reputation, then embellished and passed down long after the original grudge was forgotten. Whatever its precise origin, the legend didn't stay confined to local oral tradition. Reported sightings of a strange, winged creature in the Pine Barrens area appear scattered throughout historical records for well over 2 centuries, but the legend reached a genuine fever pitch during one extraordinary week in January 1909, when newspapers across the northeastern United States ran a flood of Jersey Devil sightings, reportedly from dozens of independent witnesses across multiple New Jersey and Pennsylvania towns within just a few days of each other. Accounts described a creature with wings, hooved feet, and a distinctive cry, leaving strange tracks in the snow that witnesses claimed they couldn't attribute to any known animal. Schools in some townships reportedly closed. Businesses in certain towns temporarily shut their doors. Pauses were organized in some accounts, and a reward was even offered by a Philadelphia entertainment promoter for the creature's capture, though naturally none was ever produced. The 1909 panic remains one of the most extensively documented cryptid flaps in American history, covered in real time by real newspapers, generating a volume of independent eyewitness testimony that is genuinely unusual for a folklore creature, even accounting for the sensationalist tendencies of early 20th century journalism. The mainstream explanation for the 1909 events, and for Jersey Devil sightings more broadly, points to a combination of factors that historians of the period consider entirely plausible. Sandhill cranes, an unusual and rarely seen bird in that part of New Jersey during the period, have a distinctive, unsettling call and an odd, ungainly flight silhouette that could plausibly be mistaken for something stranger by someone unfamiliar with the species. Media sensationalism almost certainly played a significant role as well. Once a handful of early reports appeared in print, it's not difficult to imagine copycat sightings, misidentified animals, and outright hoaxes compounding rapidly across a region already primed by 2 centuries of prior folklore. Some historians have also pointed to at least one confirmed hoax connected to the 1909 panic, involving a kangaroo fitted with fake wings and displayed by a promoter capitalizing directly on the frenzy. A detail that, while not explaining every sighting, demonstrates how quickly opportunists moved to exploit the panic once it began. But the sheer geographic spread and independence of the 1909 sightings remains something historians studying the event still find difficult to fully dismiss. Witnesses across multiple towns, separated by real distances and without modern means of rapid communication between them, described broadly consistent physical details within an extremely short window of time, well before the more sensational newspaper accounts could have plausibly spread far enough to shape every single report. Skeptics maintain that a well-established regional legend, combined with genuine cases of misidentified wildlife and a press eager for a sensational story, is more than sufficient to explain a week of collective panic without requiring anything unexplained. Others studying the pattern point out that this explanation, while reasonable, doesn't fully account for why so many independent witnesses, with no obvious means of coordinating their stories, converged so quickly on the same unusual details. The Pine Barrens are still there, still sparsely populated, still capable of swallowing sound and light the way they always have. Sightings, though far less frequent than in 1909, are still occasionally reported by hikers and residents in the region today. Was the Jersey Devil born entirely from one furious mother's curse, a colonial-era insult that outlived the feud that created it, or a genuine, misidentified bird amplified by early tabloid journalism into a regional panic? Or does its remarkable staying power, across nearly 3 centuries and one extraordinary week of independent testimony, suggest there was something in those pine woods that still hasn't been fully explained, The Pine Barrens kept their mystery contained to 1 week of panic and centuries of quieter rumor. But roughly 40 years after the Jersey Devil's most famous flap, another American town would experience something eerily similar. A wave of sightings concentrated into a short, intense window of time, involving a strange winged figure no one could quite explain. Except this time, the story wouldn't end with a panic that simply faded. It would end in tragedy on a bridge in the cold winter dark. This is Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Point Pleasant sits at the confluence of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers, a small industrial town that, in November 1966, became the center of one of the most thoroughly documented cryptid cases in American history. On the night of November 15th, 2 young couples driving near an abandoned World War II munitions site, known locally as the TNT area, reported seeing a large, gray, man-shaped figure with glowing red eyes and enormous wings, standing near the road before it took flight and reportedly kept pace with their car at speeds they estimated at up to 100 miles per hour. They reported the sighting to local police that same night, and within days, additional witnesses came forward describing similar encounters in the same general area. Local newspapers, needing a name for whatever was being described, borrowed from a campy villain in the contemporary Batman television series and began calling it Mothman, a name that stuck permanently, despite witnesses consistently describing something with distinctly more humanoid proportions than an actual moth. Over the following 13 months, dozens of individuals in and around Point Pleasant reported similar sightings, and unlike many folklore flaps that fade quickly, this case attracted the attention of professional investigators almost immediately. John Keel, a journalist who spent extensive time in Point Pleasant documenting the sightings firsthand, later compiled his research into the Mothman Prophecies, a book that would go on to shape how the entire case is remembered. Keel's reporting connected the Mothman sightings not just to the creature itself, but to a broader wave of strange phenomena the town reportedly experienced during that same period. Reports of unidentified flying objects, mysterious men in dark suits allegedly visiting witnesses and behaving strangely, and a general sense, at least as Keel documented it, that Point Pleasant had become a focal point for something the community couldn't fully explain or contain. Then, on December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge, connecting Point Pleasant to Kanawha, Ohio, across the Ohio River, collapsed during evening rush hour traffic, killing 46 people. The bridge's failure was later determined, through a rigorous federal engineering investigation, to be the result of a single small defect in one suspension chain eye-bar, a manufacturing flaw that had gone undetected for decades and finally gave way under the accumulated stress of increased traffic loads the bridge was never originally designed to carry. It was a genuine engineering tragedy, thoroughly documented, with a clear, verifiable technical cause. But because the collapse occurred within the same 13-month window as the Mothman sightings, and in the same small town, the two events became permanently linked in the public imagination, with many subsequent tellings of the legend framing Mothman not as a strange, unexplained creature, but as an omen, a supernatural warning of the disaster that was coming, seen by witnesses who had no way of understanding what they were being shown. The mainstream explanation for the original 1966 sighting centers on a large, real bird, most commonly an unusually large barred owl or possibly a sandhill crane, both of which are known to inhabit the region and can appear startlingly large and unfamiliar under headlights at night, particularly to witnesses driving quickly through an isolated, poorly lit area already known for its unsettling wartime history. The abandoned TNT area itself, a former munitions storage and manufacturing site converted after the war into a wildlife refuge, is exactly the kind of environment where an unusual bird species, or even an escaped or migrating animal unfamiliar to local witnesses, might plausibly account for at least some of the reported encounters. Skeptics also point to the culture of the sightings themselves. Once local media coverage began, and once a specific name and description took hold, subsequent witnesses may have been primed to interpret ambiguous nighttime encounters through an already established framework. The same pattern of contagion historians point to in other flap events like the Jersey Devil Panic of 1909. What that explanation doesn't fully address, and what continues to draw serious researchers back to the case decades later, is the sheer density and consistency of first-hand testimony collected within such a compressed window, from witnesses across different backgrounds, including at least 2 off-duty volunteer firefighters and a local civil defense director, individuals whose professional credibility made their accounts more difficult to dismiss outright than a typical anecdotal sighting. And the coincidence of the bridge collapse, however explainable by conventional engineering failure alone, remains a detail that even skeptical researchers acknowledge lends the case an emotional weight rarely found in other cryptid legends. A real tragedy, with real victims, forever intertwined with a mystery that was never definitively solved. Was Mothman simply a large, unfamiliar bird, amplified by isolation, wartime history, and a town primed to see something strange in the dark? Or does the sheer timing of it all, 13 months of sightings, ending mere weeks before a genuine catastrophe no one could have engineered or predicted, suggest something closer to what witnesses themselves believed at the time, that they weren't looking at a monster at all, but a warning? Point Pleasant still remembers both the creature and the bridge inseparably now, and the question that remains, more than half a century later, is whether that connection was ever anything more than tragic timing, or something the town was simply never meant to understand in time. Point Pleasant's tragedy left behind a legend inseparable from a single, catastrophic night. But some omens don't announce themselves through spectacle. Some have been walking quietly along English footpaths and coastal roads for so many centuries that entire regions built their local geography around avoiding them, around one recurring, deceptively simple shape appearing at the edge of the road after dark. A large black dog standing where no dog should be. Black dog folklore is remarkably widespread across the British Isles, appearing in local legend from Yorkshire to Norfolk to the West Country, under dozens of regional names: Black Shuck along the eastern coast of England, Barguest in Yorkshire, Padfoot, Skriker, and Gwilgi in various other regions, each carrying slightly different local details, but sharing a striking core description. A dog, far larger than any natural breed, black as pitch, with eyes that witnesses across centuries and regions describe with unusual consistency as glowing red, or sometimes a burning yellow, appearing suddenly along a specific stretch of road, a churchyard path, or a coastal route before vanishing without a trace. Encountering one, according to most regional traditions, was never a neutral event. In the majority of tellings, seeing the black dog was an omen of death, either for the witness or for someone close to them, though a smaller number of regional variants describe more protective versions of the same creature, one said to guide travelers safely home through dangerous terrain rather than threaten them. The earliest substantial written references to English black dog folklore date back to the medieval period, but the legend's most famous and best documented single incident occurred on August 4, 1577, in the Suffolk village of Bungay. According to a pamphlet published that same year by Reverend Abraham Fleming, titled A Stroun's and Terrible Wonder, a violent thunderstorm struck the town of Bungay during Sunday church services, and in the midst of the storm a black dog reportedly burst into the church itself, running between 2 kneeling parishioners and killing them instantly, their bodies described as scorched, before the creature fled to the nearby village of Blithburgh, where it struck again at another church, leaving claw marks reportedly still visible on the church door for centuries afterward, marks that some local guides in Blythburgh point to on the door even today. Fleming's pamphlet remains one of the earliest and most detailed surviving written accounts of any black dog encounter in English folklore, and it's genuinely remarkable from a historical standpoint, precisely because it wasn't oral tradition recorded generations later. It was published and circulated within the same year the event allegedly occurred, describing what witnesses in the town, and the clergy present, insisted they had seen. The mainstream explanation for the Bungay incident, and for black dog sightings more broadly, centers on a combination of genuine natural phenomena and the psychological effect of severe weather on frightened communities. Ball lightning, an extremely rare and still not fully understood atmospheric electrical phenomenon, has been proposed by some researchers as a possible explanation for the church deaths, potentially producing exactly the kind of sudden, scorching injury described in Fleming's account during a severe electrical storm. As for the broader tradition of black dog sightings across centuries and regions, folklorists point to a more straightforward psychological explanation. Large black dogs, whether feral, escaped, or simply unfamiliar breeds encountered unexpectedly on a dark road, are precisely the kind of ordinary but startling sight that a frightened traveler, already primed by centuries of local superstition, might interpret through an established supernatural framework, particularly along isolated rural roads at night where genuine visibility was extremely limited before modern lighting. But that explanation, reasonable as it is for isolated sightings, doesn't fully account for the sheer geographic consistency of the black dog tradition across the British Isles, nor for a detail that folklorists studying the phenomenon have long found difficult to dismiss entirely: the specific locations where black dog sightings cluster. Across dozens of documented regional traditions, black dog encounters are reported overwhelmingly along old roads, ancient boundary lines, churchyards, bridges, and crossroads. Locations that, in pre-Christian British and Celtic tradition, were already independently associated with liminal, spiritually significant space, boundaries between one territory and another, or between the world of the living and the dead. Some folklorists have proposed that black dog folklore may represent one of the oldest continuously surviving belief systems in British folklore, potentially predating Christianity's arrival in the region entirely, with the dog itself serving as a guardian or marker of exactly the kind of threshold locations later Christian tradition would reinterpret through its own framework of omens and warnings. That theory remains speculative and difficult to prove definitively, given how much of pre-Christian British belief was never written down before Christianity became dominant across the region. But it raises a genuine question worth sitting with. Why does a legend found independently across so many separate regions of Britain, described by witnesses with no contact with one another across centuries, converge so consistently not just on the creature's appearance, but on the specific kinds of places it's said to appear? Reports of large, unexplained black dogs along old roads and churchyards continue even now, into the present day, still concentrated disproportionately along exactly the kind of ancient boundary routes earlier folklorists identified centuries ago. Was the black dog simply an ordinary animal, repeatedly filtered through centuries of superstition and the genuine terror of walking dark, rural roads before electric light existed? Or does its remarkable consistency across geography, across centuries, and across the specific kinds of liminal places it's said to haunt, suggest something closer to what the oldest traditions claimed all along, that certain thresholds in the landscape itself have always needed a guardian, whether or not anyone still remembers exactly what it was guarding against? The black dog guards its thresholds on land, along roads and boundary lines worn smooth by centuries of careful avoidance. But travel far enough north, past the Scottish mainland, out into the wind-scoured Orkney Islands, and you'll find a threshold guardian of an entirely different order, one that doesn't wait at the edge of the road, but rises, according to legend, straight out of the sea itself. This is the Nuckelavee. Of all the creatures in Scottish and Orcadian folklore, few are described with the sheer, deliberate horror attached to the Nuckelavee. Unlike the black dog, which at least resembles something recognizably animal, or Baba Yaga, who retains a human shape however unsettling her surroundings, the Nuckelavee is described in Orkney oral tradition as something closer to an anatomical nightmare. Most accounts describe a creature that appears to be a monstrous fusion of man and horse, but with a crucial and deliberate absence: no skin. Witnesses in the old tales describe seeing black blood coursing visibly through yellow veins, muscle and sinew exposed to the open air. A single, enormous, unblinking red eye, and a head that could swing disturbingly loose upon its neck. Some versions describe the horse-like lower half and the humanoid upper half as fused so completely that no seam between them could be identified at all. In nearly every account, the Nuckelavee's breath alone was said to be capable of withering crops, sickening livestock, and poisoning wells, and the creature was universally understood in Orkney tradition to despise fresh water, unable to cross running streams, which meant that reaching one during an encounter was, according to the old advice passed between generations, a person's only real chance of survival. The Nuckelavee's folklore is tied specifically and almost exclusively to Orkney, a remote archipelago off the northeastern coast of Scotland, a place whose isolation, harsh weather, and dependence on the sea for both livelihood and survival shaped a distinct folkloric tradition somewhat separate from mainland Scottish and broader British legend. Much of what we know about the Nuckelavee today comes from a specific, well-documented source: Walter Trail Dennison, a 19th-century Orkney folklorist who collected oral traditions directly from local residents and published detailed accounts of the creature in the 1880s, preserving descriptions that had likely been passed down through generations of Orkney storytellers before ever being written down. Dennison's work remains one of the primary reasons the Nuckelavee is so specifically and vividly described compared to many regional folklore figures whose details grew vaguer with each retelling. His direct engagement with Orkney oral tradition captured details that might otherwise have been lost entirely as the islands modernized. Among the traditions Dennison recorded, one stands out for its historical specificity. Local Orkney tradition attributed a genuine, devastating 19th-century cattle plague, known as murrain, directly to the Nuckelavee's poisonous breath, describing the creature as having risen from the sea specifically to punish the islands during a period of real agricultural hardship. This detail is significant because, unlike many folklore figures whose supernatural explanations exist in a kind of permanent, undated past, the Nuckelavee's mythology was actively being applied to explain a real, documented agricultural crisis well within living memory of the people telling the story, suggesting the legend remained a genuinely active belief system, not merely inherited superstition, right up through the 19th century. The mainstream explanation for the Nuckelavee's origins points to Orkney's particular relationship with the sea and horses. Unlike much of mainland Scotland, Orkney's economy and daily life depended heavily on both maritime industry and small, sturdy native horses used for agricultural labor across the island's difficult terrain. Folklorists studying regional variation in British water spirit legends note that coastal and island communities across northern Europe frequently developed malevolent seahorse hybrid figures, a pattern found not just in Orkney but in related legends like the Scottish Kelpie and various Scandinavian water spirits, suggesting a broader cultural pattern of associating dangerous, unpredictable coastal waters with horse imagery, likely because horses represented both genuine daily utility and genuine daily danger to island communities who depended on them. The Nuckelavee's skinless, anatomically horrifying appearance, some researchers suggest, may reflect a particularly Orcadian intensification of that broader pattern, shaped by the island's extreme isolation and correspondingly distinct storytelling tradition. But that explanation doesn't fully account for a detail that separates the Nuckelavee from most of its northern European water spirit relatives: the extraordinarily specific physiological detail in its description, particularly the consistent emphasis across multiple independently collected accounts on exposed muscle, visible circulation, and the absence of skin specifically, details considerably more anatomically graphic than the typical drowning hazard water spirits found elsewhere in British and Scandinavian folklore. Some folklorists have puzzled over why Orkney's version of this widespread coastal archetype developed such uniquely visceral, almost clinical physical detail compared to its counterparts elsewhere, a level of specificity that seems to exceed what a simple "the sea is dangerous" and "horses are too cautionary" framework would necessarily require. Was the Nuckelavee simply Orkney's regional expression of a much broader European tradition connecting perilous coastal waters to horse imagery, its uniquely horrifying details a product of the island's isolated storytelling tradition intensifying over generations? Or does the specificity of that horror and its direct application to a genuine 19th century agricultural crisis, well within living memory, suggest something the people of Orkney understood about their coastline that a simple cautionary framework doesn't fully capture? The archipelago's relationship with the sea that surrounds it remains as central to island life today as it was when Denison first recorded these accounts, and the running streams the old stories insisted could offer protection still cut through that same landscape, whether or not anyone still remembers with certainty what they were once believed capable of keeping out. The Nuckelavee rises from the sea itself, a horror confined to Orkney's most isolated shores. But its cousin in Scottish folklore didn't need the open ocean to do its work. It needed only a loch, a river, or even a modest, unremarkable stream, and the oldest, most universal weakness in human nature: the desire to reach out and touch something beautiful. This is the Kelpie, scattered across nearly every region of Scotland, in the folklore attached to specific, named bodies of water rather than any single general location. The Kelpie is described, in its most common form, as a shape-shifting water spirit that most frequently appeared as a horse. Not a monstrous, skinless horror like the Nuckelavee, but something far more dangerous precisely because of how ordinary and inviting it looked. Accounts collected across Scotland describe a beautiful, sleek, black or white horse discovered grazing near a riverbank or loch shore, seemingly gentle, seemingly lost, seemingly exactly the kind of animal a tired traveler might be relieved to find. The danger revealed itself only once someone made the mistake of climbing onto its back. According to the folklore, a Kelpie's skin possessed an adhesive quality the moment a rider touched it, binding them to the creature instantly and irreversibly. The Kelpie would then bolt directly into the nearest deep water, dragging its trapped rider down to drown, before, in the most gruesome versions of the tale, consuming everything except the liver, which would later wash ashore as the only remaining evidence of what had happened. Unlike some folklore figures who appear consistently across an entire country, Kelpie legends in Scotland were remarkably specific to individual locations, with distinct bodies of water across the highlands and lowlands, each carrying their own local variant of the tale, their own particular details, and sometimes even their own specific name for the creature said to inhabit that exact loch or river. The River Spey, the River Conan, and numerous lochs throughout the highlands each developed their own Kelpie tradition, passed down by communities who lived and worked immediately alongside genuinely dangerous water. This hyperlocal quality is significant to folklorists, because it suggests the legend wasn't simply an imported or generalized cautionary tale applied uniformly across the country, but something that grew directly out of specific communities' direct, repeated experience with specific, genuinely hazardous stretches of water, each with their own currents, depths, and history of drownings. Written references to Kelpie folklore appear as early as the 18th century in Scottish literary and antiquarian sources, though, as with most of the legends explored in this series, the oral tradition almost certainly reaches back considerably further, likely rooted in the same broader Celtic and pre-Christian traditions that shaped related water horse legends found across the British Isles, including the Nuckelavee's Orcadian tradition and comparable figures in Welsh and Irish folklore. What distinguishes the Kelpie from many of its regional cousins is the sheer volume of surviving local variation, collected extensively by 19th-century folklorists and antiquarians who traveled through rural Scotland, specifically documenting oral traditions before industrialization and population shifts eroded the close generational relationship many rural communities had maintained with these particular bodies of water. The mainstream explanation for the Kelpie legend's development and persistence is, in many ways, the most straightforwardly practical of any legend explored so far in this series. Scotland's rivers, lochs, and streams, particularly in the Highlands, are and were genuinely dangerous, characterized by sudden depth changes, powerful currents, and water temperatures cold enough to induce fatal shock within minutes even for strong swimmers. Before modern flood barriers, warning signage, and widespread swimming education, drowning was a persistent, well-documented hazard across rural Scottish communities, and children in particular were understood to be at the highest risk, drawn toward water for play, for chores like fetching water, or for the simple curiosity of encountering an unfamiliar animal near a riverbank. Folklorists studying cautionary water spirit legends across Northern Europe consistently note a striking pattern. These stories cluster most heavily in exactly the regions and communities where drowning represented the greatest genuine, statistical danger to daily life, suggesting the Kelpie functioned at its most basic level as an extraordinarily effective piece of safety folklore, weaponizing a child's natural attraction to a beautiful animal into a specific, memorable warning against approaching unfamiliar water's edge at all. That explanation accounts for a great deal, but it doesn't fully address a detail that folklorists studying the Kelpie's specific regional variants have found harder to dismiss so simply: the consistency, across dozens of independently developed local traditions, of the adhesive skin detail specifically, a remarkably unusual and specific mechanism of entrapment that appears with striking regularity across communities separated by considerable distance and limited historical means of direct communication. A general warning against unfamiliar animals near water doesn't obviously require such a specific, consistent physical mechanism to be effective as a cautionary tale. Some folklorists have proposed that the adhesive skin detail may reflect genuine, close observational familiarity among rural highland communities with real horses and their physical properties, worked into an already existing water spirit tradition to make the warning feel more physically plausible and therefore more effective. Others studying comparative Celtic mythology point to similar binding or adhesion motifs appearing in unrelated folklore traditions across the British Isles and beyond, raising the more speculative question of whether this specific narrative device reflects something older and more widely shared across pre-Christian belief systems than any single regional Kelpie tradition alone can fully explain. There is also the matter of the liver, the detail, present in numerous but not all versions of the legend, specifying that a Kelpie's victim would be entirely consumed except for that single organ, which would later wash ashore as grim confirmation of what had happened. Folklorists have offered relatively little confident explanation for why this particular, oddly specific detail recurs across multiple independent tellings. Beyond noting that the liver's association with life and blood in various historical, medical, and folk traditions may have made it a symbolically resonant detail to include, a fragment of the body understood, in older frameworks of anatomy and belief, to be somehow more essential or telling than the rest. Was the Kelpie simply Scotland's most effective piece of inherited water safety folklore? Its adhesive skin and horse-like beauty, a deliberately memorable warning, crafted by communities who understood exactly how dangerous their local rivers and lochs genuinely were? Or does the remarkable specificity of its details, consistent across so many independently developed local traditions, suggest the legend preserves something considerably older and less fully understood than a straightforward cautionary tale would require? Scotland's lochs and rivers remain as cold, as deep, and in places as genuinely treacherous as they were when these stories first took root along their banks, still carrying, in the names, locals still use for certain stretches of water, whatever it was those communities once believed lived beneath the surface. The Kelpie's danger lay in disguise, beauty offered as bait along a riverbank. But not every shape-shifting spirit in world folklore exists purely to lure and destroy. Travel east, far from the cold lochs of the Scottish Highlands, to the shrine gates and rice fields of Japan, and you'll find a spirit whose relationship with humanity is far more complicated. Sometimes protector, sometimes trickster, sometimes something considerably harder to categorize at all. This is the Kitsune. In Japanese folklore, the Kitsune, literally fox in Japanese, though the term carries far more weight than the simple translation suggests, occupies a position unlike almost any other creature explored in this series so far. Foxes native to Japan were long observed, across the centuries of rural agricultural life, exhibiting genuinely unusual behavior compared to other wildlife. Notable intelligence, apparent cunning in raiding grain stores and hunting, and a general elusiveness that made them difficult to track or predict. That real, observed behavior became the foundation for one of the most elaborate spirit traditions in Japanese folklore, one deeply intertwined with Shinto religious practice rather than existing purely as secular superstition. Foxes are specifically associated with Inari, the Shinto deity of rice, agriculture, and prosperity, and to this day, fox statues, carved from stone, often depicted holding a key or a jewel in their mouths, stand guard at the entrances of Inari shrines across Japan, including the famous thousands of vermilion torii gates at Fushimi Inari Taisha, near Kyoto, one of the most visited religious sites in the entire country. According to traditional belief, Kitsune are not born with their full supernatural abilities. Instead, folklore holds that a fox gains power, wisdom, and additional tails as it ages, with the most powerful Kitsune eventually possessing 9 tails, a form associated with immense age, wisdom, and formidable magical ability. Central to nearly every account of the Kitsune is the ability to shapeshift, most famously into the form of a beautiful human woman, though male human forms and other transformations appear across various regional tales as well. Some stories describe Kitsune who married human men while concealing their true nature for years, only to be discovered through some small, telling detail, a fox's tail glimpsed by accident, a shadow that didn't match its owner, or, in one especially persistent narrative motif found across multiple collected tales, a fox's reflection failing to match the human form standing in front of a mirror. What makes the Kitsune genuinely distinct from many other shape-shifting folklore figures examined throughout this series is the sheer moral range attributed to them. Japanese folklore generally divides Kitsune into 2 broad categories: Zenko, benevolent celestial foxes associated with Inari, believed to protect households, bring good fortune, and occasionally serve as guardian spirits for families or entire communities; and Yako, wild foxes considered more mischievous or outright malevolent, prone to trickery, deception, and in some of the more unsettling tales, capable of possessing human beings entirely, a condition historically referred to as kitsunetsuki, or fox possession. This wasn't merely a narrative device confined to old stories. Historical Japanese medical and religious records, particularly from the Edo period, document kitsunetsuki as a recognized folk diagnosis, applied to individuals exhibiting symptoms that, viewed through a modern lens, likely corresponded to various forms of mental illness, seizure disorders, or other neurological conditions poorly understood at the time. Families affected by kitsunetsuki sometimes sought treatment not from physicians but from Shinto or Buddhist priests, specifically trained in exorcism rituals intended to remove the possessing fox spirit, a practice that, remarkably, continued in some rural areas of Japan well into the 20th century. This overlap between folklore and documented historical medical practice gives the kitsune legend an unusually well-preserved paper trail compared to many oral traditions explored elsewhere in this series. Temple and shrine records, along with regional historical documents, describe specific kitsunetsuki cases with dates, locations, and the treatments applied, offering historians a genuinely rare window into how deeply this particular folklore belief shaped real medical and social responses across centuries of Japanese history, rather than existing purely as entertainment or children's cautionary tale. The mainstream academic explanation for the kitsune's development follows a pattern familiar from several legends already explored in this series. Real, closely observed animal behavior, filtered through a culture's existing religious and spiritual framework, gradually accumulating layers of narrative complexity across centuries of retelling. Foxes really were, and remain, unusually intelligent and adaptable animals compared to much of the wildlife historically native to rural Japan, genuinely capable of the kind of cunning, opportunistic behavior, raiding stored grain, avoiding traps, appearing and disappearing with apparent purpose, that would naturally invite a culture already deeply attuned to spiritual explanations for the natural world to attribute something more than ordinary animal intelligence to them. As for kitsunetsuki specifically, most modern medical historians view it as a pre-scientific cultural framework for understanding genuine, but at the time poorly understood, neurological and psychiatric conditions, not fundamentally different from how other cultures across this series' exploration have historically attributed unexplained mental or physical suffering to possession, curses, or supernatural affliction. But that explanation, while broadly accepted, doesn't fully address certain persistent details that continue to interest researchers studying the tradition. Historical accounts of kitsunetsuki treatment describe cases where family members reported specific, unusual physical symptoms during the supposed possession: sudden shifts in voice, reported cravings for foods specifically associated with foxes in Japanese tradition like fried tofu, and, most curiously, cases where the possessed individual reportedly displayed knowledge or information they otherwise had no plausible way of knowing. Whether these details reflect genuine unexplained phenomena, elaborate cultural performance shaped by deeply internalized belief, family or community pressure to conform to an expected narrative once a kitsunetsuki diagnosis had been socially applied, or simple selective memory and record-keeping favoring the most dramatic accounts, remains a question historians of Japanese folk religion continue to debate without full resolution. Was the kitsune simply Japan's elaborate, centuries-long cultural framework for understanding an unusually intelligent animal and the poorly understood illnesses that predated modern medicine, a folklore tradition eventually so deeply woven into Shinto practice that its fox guardians still stand watch at shrine gates today? Or does the tradition's remarkable moral complexity, its genuine medical documentation, and its persistent specific details about possession and transformation suggest something that centuries of Japanese observers were pointing toward with more precision than a simple animal observation explanation fully captures. The stone foxes still guard the entrance to Fushimi Inari, and countless shrines like it across Japan, keys and jewels held carefully in their carved mouths, watching over thresholds that, according to the oldest traditions, were never simply symbolic at all. The kitsune watches over thresholds at the edge of rice fields and shrine gates, close to human settlement, close to the rhythms of agricultural life. But Japan's folklore also carries spirits that belong to a wilder, less hospitable domain, the steep, forested mountains that cover roughly 70% of the country's landmass, places where villages thin out and the trees grow old enough to have names of their own. It's in that terrain, according to centuries of tradition, that a very different kind of spirit has always made its home. This is the Tengu. Among the most visually distinctive and long-documented supernatural beings in Japanese folklore, the Tengu occupies a curious position, having evolved considerably in both appearance and moral character across more than 1,000 years of continuous tradition. The earliest references to Tengu in Japanese literature date back to the 8th century, appearing initially as ominous, bird-like, or dog-like creatures associated with disaster and misfortune, likely influenced by earlier Chinese folklore traditions describing similar sky-dwelling omens. Over subsequent centuries, however, the Tengu's depiction shifted dramatically, gradually taking on the more familiar form recognized in Japanese art and folklore today. A red-faced, long-nosed humanoid figure, often depicted wearing the distinctive small black cap and pom-pom sash associated with Yamabushi, the mountain-dwelling ascetic practitioners of Shugendo, a religious tradition blending Shinto, Buddhist, and folk mountain worship practices. That connection to Yamabushi practitioners is significant, and it's one of the details that makes the Tengu legend particularly interesting from a historical standpoint. Shugendo ascetics genuinely did, and in smaller numbers still do, retreat deep into Japan's mountain wilderness for extended periods of solitary spiritual training, seeking enlightenment and supernatural power through austere practices in exactly the kind of remote, physically demanding terrain where Tengu were said to reside. Historical records describe these practitioners as having developed extraordinary physical endurance and, according to some accounts, genuinely unusual abilities after years of mountain training, and the visual overlap between Yamabushi religious dress and traditional Tengu depictions was, according to most folklorists, entirely intentional, reflecting a cultural understanding that the Tengu and the ascetics who sought them out in the deep mountains were, in some sense, cut from the same otherworldly cloth. Traditional Tengu folklore describes them as formidable, sometimes dangerous, but not purely malevolent, occupying a similarly complex moral territory to the kitsune, though expressed through very different behavior. Tengu were widely believed to be skilled, even supreme, martial artists and swordsmen, and one of the most enduring strands of Japanese legend holds that Tengu were responsible for training some of history's most legendary warriors in secret mountain locations, most famously the 12th century military commander Minamoto no Yoshitsune, whose historical military successes were, according to popular legend recorded in later centuries, partly attributed to secret swordsmanship training received from a Tengu named Sojobo on Mount Kurama during his youth. Yoshitsune himself is a well-documented historical figure, and Mount Kurama remains a real, physically accessible mountain north of Kyoto, home to a temple complex that continues to actively commemorate the Tengu legend today, complete with statues and shrine elements specifically dedicated to Sojobo, a striking example of how thoroughly this particular folklore tradition became embedded into the physical, visitable landscape of a real historical site. Tengu were also credited, throughout the medieval and early modern periods, with a wide range of mischievous, sometimes dangerous behavior directed at travelers and monks who ventured too deep into their mountain territory without proper respect or caution, leading hikers astray onto dangerous paths, starting unexplained fires, kidnapping monks who had grown arrogant in their religious practice, or mimicking human voices to lure the unwary off established trails. This last detail connects to a broader, still used piece of Japanese folk vocabulary, kamikakushi, meaning spirited away, historically used to explain sudden, unexplained disappearances, particularly of children, in mountain and forest regions, with Tengu frequently cited among the possible supernatural causes. The mainstream historical explanation for the Tengu's development follows a familiar arc for legends rooted in genuinely remote, physically hazardous terrain. Japan's mountains are steep, densely forested, and were historically difficult to navigate safely, particularly before modern trail infrastructure, and unexplained disappearances, accidents, and disorientation in these environments were a real, persistent danger across centuries of Japanese history. A cultural framework attributing these disappearances to a powerful, territorial spirit served both a cautionary function, discouraging casual, disrespectful entry into genuinely dangerous wilderness, and a psychologically comforting one, providing families and communities with an explanation, however supernatural, for losses that might otherwise remain permanently unresolved. The Tengu's evolution from purely malevolent omen in the 8th century toward a more complex, sometimes even respected figure by the medieval period, likely reflects, according to most folklorists, its gradual entanglement with the genuinely respected, if feared, tradition of Shugendo mountain asceticism, with the spirit's reputation shifting to mirror the ambiguous cultural status of the human ascetics increasingly associated with it. What that explanation accounts for less completely is the persistence and specificity of the swordsmanship training legends, particularly surrounding Yoshitsune, a genuine historical military figure whose real, documented battlefield successes were significant enough that later generations apparently felt they required a supernatural explanation beyond ordinary training and talent. Some historians studying the legend's development note that attributing extraordinary human skill to supernatural mountain instruction is a narrative pattern that appears elsewhere in world folklore as well, a way of processing genuinely exceptional human ability that seems to exceed ordinary explanation. Others point to the sheer consistency of specific mountain locations across Japan, Mount Kurama among them, that maintained continuous, actively practiced Tengu-related religious and cultural traditions for centuries, asking whether that continuity reflects nothing more than successfully preserved cultural memory, or whether it points to something about those specific locations that repeatedly reinforced the tradition long after purely narrative folklore might otherwise have faded. Was the Tengu simply Japan's cultural explanation for the genuine dangers of its mountain wilderness, gradually reshaped by its association with real, respected ascetic practitioners into one of the folklore's more morally complex spirits? Or does its remarkable staying power, anchored to specific, still visited mountain locations, and intertwined with the real achievements of documented historical figures like Yoshitsune, suggest these mountains held something in the popular imagination that a straightforward, cautionary framework doesn't fully capture? Mount Kurama's shrine to Sojobo still stands, still visited, still maintained, in a country where roughly 70% of the land remains the same steep, forested terrain the Tengu were always said to call home. The Tengu claims Japan's mountains, its territory measured in elevation and forest canopy, but descend from those peaks, follow the rivers as they wind down through the valleys and out into the rice paddies and irrigation canals that sustained rural Japanese life for centuries, and you'll find a very different kind of spirit waiting in the shallows, smaller, stranger, and in its own way, considerably more dangerous to the people who lived and worked alongside its waters every single day. This is the Kappa. Few creatures in Japanese folklore are as visually distinctive or as regionally specific as the Kappa. Traditional descriptions consistently depict a small, humanoid creature, roughly the size of a child, with green or occasionally blue-tinted skin, webbed hands and feet suited for swimming, a beak-like mouth, and a shell on its back resembling a turtle's. The single most consistent and important physical detail across virtually every regional variant, however, is the depression on top of the Kappa's head, a shallow, water-filled basin called a sara, believed to be the literal source of the creature's supernatural strength. According to the folklore, if that water spilled or dried out, the Kappa would become weak, immobilized, or in some tellings would die outright, a detail that gave rise to one of the most consistently repeated pieces of practical folk advice found anywhere in Japanese tradition. If a person ever encountered a Kappa, the safest response was to bow deeply, because Kappa were bound by a rigid, almost compulsive sense of etiquette, and would instinctively bow back, spilling the water from their head in the process and rendering themselves harmless. Kappa folklore is documented extensively across nearly every region of Japan, with written references appearing as early as the medieval period, though, as with the Tengu and Kitsune, the oral tradition likely reaches back considerably further. What distinguishes the Kappa from many of the other water spirits examined throughout this series is the sheer specificity and consistency of the danger it was said to pose, a danger tightly, almost clinically tied to the real physical hazards of Japan's rural waterways. Kappa were widely blamed for drowning deaths, particularly of children and livestock, in rivers, ponds, and the extensive irrigation canal systems that crisscrossed Japan's agricultural regions for centuries. But the folklore went considerably further than simple drowning. Numerous regional accounts describe the Kappa as specifically targeting a mythical organ called the shirikodama, said to be located just inside the anus, which the creature would extract from its victims, sometimes by reaching inside the body during an attack. This detail, while genuinely unsettling, is treated by most folklorists studying the tradition not as arbitrary horror, but as a culturally specific way of processing a real, observable, and deeply disturbing phenomenon: the bloating and unusual bodily changes that occur in drowning victims, particularly after extended submersion, misattributed by pre-modern communities lacking forensic medical knowledge to deliberate supernatural mutilation rather than the natural physical process of decomposition in water. This connection between Kappa folklore and drowning is far more than coincidental cultural association. Historical Japanese agricultural communities depended enormously on rice paddy irrigation, and the resulting network of canals, ponds, and slow-moving waterways created exactly the kind of environment where small children, sent to fetch water or play near the water's edge while parents worked the fields, were at genuinely elevated risk of drowning, often in water shallow and unassuming enough that adults might not think to actively supervise it. Village elders across numerous documented regions specifically invoked Kappa warnings to keep children away from these waterways, a pattern folklorists studying the tradition consider one of the clearest examples in Japanese folklore of a supernatural belief system functioning as active, deliberate child safety education, reinforced generation after generation by a specific creature, specific behaviors to avoid, and even specific memorable protective rituals like the etiquette-based bowing technique. The mainstream academic explanation for the Kappa's development and remarkable staying power centers on exactly this practical function. Japan's rural waterway systems posed a genuine, statistically significant drowning risk across centuries of agricultural life, and a vivid, specific, and memorably strange creature associated with that risk proved to be an extraordinarily effective tool for reinforcing caution in children too young to fully grasp abstract danger. The Shirikodama detail, while disturbing, likely reflects an attempt by pre-modern communities to explain genuinely observed but poorly understood post-drowning bodily changes through the cultural and supernatural framework available to them. Not unlike how other cultures examined throughout this series have historically attributed unexplained physical phenomena to supernatural causes rather than the biological processes better understood today. Some historians have also connected certain Kappa depictions to garbled folk memory or misidentification of real animals occasionally encountered near Japanese waterways, including Japanese giant salamanders, which can grow to remarkable size and possess a genuinely unusual, faintly humanoid silhouette when glimpsed partially submerged in dim light. That explanation accounts for a great deal of the tradition's practical function, but it leaves certain persistent details less fully resolved. Folklorists studying regional variation across Japan have noted that Kappa traditions, much like the highly localized Kelpie legends of Scotland, developed distinct regional personalities and specific behavioral quirks tied to individual rivers and villages, some benevolent enough to be credited with teaching local farmers irrigation techniques or bone-setting medical knowledge in exchange for offerings. Others considered uniformly dangerous with no redeeming qualities whatsoever. This significant regional variation in moral character, layered on top of remarkably consistent core physical details like the water-filled head basin and the bowing vulnerability, has led some researchers to ask whether the Kappa tradition represents a single coherent belief system regionally adapted over centuries, or something closer to multiple independently converging water spirit traditions that happen to consolidate around a strikingly similar core physical description for reasons not yet fully understood. Was the Kappa simply Japan's regionally varied answer to a very real, very persistent drowning hazard, its strange and specific details reflecting centuries of communities processing genuine tragedy through the cultural tools available to them? Or does the sheer consistency of its most distinctive features, that water-filled basin, that rigid, exploitable sense of etiquette, recurring with such precision across regions with limited historical contact, suggest a shared cultural root considerably older and more specific than a general water safety cautionary tale would necessarily require? Japan's rice paddies and irrigation canals remain as central to its rural landscape today as they were centuries ago, still quiet, still shallow, still, according to the oldest stories, not entirely empty. The Kappa's danger lurks in shallow sun-warmed water, a threat tied to the rhythms of planting and harvest. But Japan's folklore doesn't confine its dangers to warm months. Travel north into the mountainous regions of Japan that receive some of the heaviest snowfall anywhere on Earth, and wait for the season to turn, and you'll find a spirit whose danger arrives not with drought or flood, but with the first true blizzard of winter. Silent, beautiful, and, according to centuries of tradition, patient enough to wait outside your door until you make a fatal mistake. This is Yuki-onna, the Snow Woman. Among the most hauntingly beautiful figures in Japanese folklore, Yuki-onna is described with remarkable consistency across regional variants collected throughout Japan's snowiest prefectures, particularly in areas like Niigata, Yamagata, and other regions along the country's northern and western coasts that experience the kind of extreme, sustained winter snowfall few other inhabited regions in the world receive. She appears, according to the traditional accounts, as a tall, strikingly beautiful woman with unnaturally pale, almost translucent skin, long black hair, and a white kimono, materializing during snowstorms, sometimes floating silently just above the snow's surface rather than leaving footprints. her breath visible as a pale mist that, in many versions of the legend, carries a lethal, freezing chill. Travelers caught in a snowstorm, particularly those foolish or unlucky enough to be traveling alone at night through mountain passes during heavy snowfall, were said to encounter her standing motionless in the blizzard, and those who approached her, entranced by her beauty or simply desperate for guidance through the storm, risked having the very life and warmth drained directly from their bodies by her freezing breath, left to be found, if they were found at all, frozen solid in the snow, with an expression some tellings describe as peaceful, even content, as though death by her hand carried none of the terror one might expect. What makes Yuki-onna genuinely distinct from many other seasonal or environmental folklore figures examined throughout this series is the sheer narrative complexity attached to her across different regional tellings. A complexity that pushes her well beyond a simple cautionary winter storm warning. The most famous version of her story, popularized internationally through Lafcadio Hearn's 1904 collection, Kwaidan, Stories and Studies of Strange Things, describes Yuki-onna sparing a young woodcutter's life during a deadly blizzard encounter, on the strict condition that he never speak of what he witnessed to anyone. Years later, according to the tale, the woodcutter marries a mysterious, beautiful woman named Oyuki, who bears his children and lives with him seemingly as an ordinary wife for years, until one night, in a moment of careless intimacy, he finally breaks his old promise and describes the strange, beautiful woman he once encountered in a snowstorm as a young man. Oyuki reveals herself, in that moment, to have been Yuki-onna all along, and though she spares him a second time for the sake of their children, she vanishes into the snow forever, the marriage and the years of domestic life dissolving as suddenly as the storm that first brought them together. Hearn's specific 1904 version, while responsible for making Yuki-onna internationally recognizable, was drawn from oral traditions Hearn collected directly from Japanese sources during his extensive residence in Japan, and considerable regional variation existed, and continues to exist, well beyond his particular retelling. Some regional traditions describe Yuki-onna as uniformly malevolent, with no capacity for mercy or emotional attachment to humans whatsoever. Others describe her, much like several other spirits examined throughout this series, occupying a more genuinely ambiguous moral position, capable of both lethal violence and, in certain tellings, something closer to genuine longing or loneliness, an entity drawn toward human warmth and companionship, even as her fundamental nature made prolonged closeness to humanity ultimately impossible, even fatal. This narrative flexibility, folklorists studying the tradition have noted, allowed Yuki-onna's story to function simultaneously as multiple things at once across different communities. A stark, practical warning about the genuine, statistically significant dangers of winter travel in Japan's heaviest snowfall regions, and, in her more romantic and tragic tellings, a meditation on isolation, the impossibility of certain kinds of belonging, and the particular loneliness of Japan's harshest, most physically isolating winters. The regions where Yuki-onna folklore developed most extensively were not chosen arbitrarily. Areas like Niigata and Yamagata regularly receive snowfall measured in meters rather than centimeters across a single winter season, among the heaviest recorded snowfall totals anywhere on the inhabited planet. A consequence of cold Siberian air masses colliding with moisture, picked up crossing the Sea of Japan before dropping enormous quantities of snow across the mountainous terrain of Japan's northwestern coast. Historical records from these regions document genuine, recurring winter dangers well into the modern era. Travelers and laborers stranded or killed by sudden whiteout conditions, avalanche risk in mountain passes, and the specific, well-documented physiological danger of hypothermia-induced euphoria. a real medical phenomenon in which victims of severe cold exposure, in the final stages before death, sometimes experience a sudden, disorienting sense of warmth, calm, or even peaceful hallucination rather than continued distress, occasionally accompanied by a compulsion to remove clothing, worsening their condition even further. Medical historians and folklorists studying Yuki-onna's more specific narrative details, particularly the recurring description of victims found with a strangely peaceful expression, have pointed directly to this well-documented physiological phenomenon as a likely and genuinely compelling source for one of the legend's most consistently unsettling details. The mainstream explanation for Yuki-onna's development, much like several legends already covered in this exploration, centers on the practical intersection of genuine environmental danger and the psychological need to give that danger a comprehensible face. Winter travel through Japan's heaviest snowfall regions was, for centuries, a genuinely life-threatening undertaking, and a supernatural figure specifically associated with the most dangerous conditions. Solitary night travel, sudden severe storms, disorientation and whiteout conditions served the same protective function folklorists have identified repeatedly throughout this series, transforming an abstract statistical risk into a vivid, memorable, and specifically avoidable danger. The detail of hypothermia's peculiar euphoric final stage, matched so closely against traditional descriptions of Yuki-onna's victims, represents exactly the kind of close, if unconsciously encoded, environmental observation folklorists have found running through so many of the legends examined across world traditions, genuine physical phenomena reinterpreted through whatever supernatural framework a given culture had available to explain them. But that explanation, thorough as it is for the cautionary function of the legend, doesn't fully account for the specific emotional and narrative complexity that developed around Yuki-onna compared to more straightforwardly threatening seasonal folklore figures found elsewhere in world tradition. Few winter danger folklore figures in other cultures developed anything resembling the Oyuki narrative, a sustained story of disguised domestic life, genuine apparent affection, children, and a tragic rule-based unraveling, triggered specifically by a broken promise rather than any direct malicious act. Folklorists specializing in Japanese supernatural tradition have proposed that this narrative complexity may reflect a deeper cultural tendency found across numerous Japanese yokai traditions examined throughout this exploration, including the kitsune's own capacity for disguised marriage and eventual discovery, towards stories exploring the fundamental incompatibility, however loving, between human and supernatural existence, a recurring theme considerably less common in the folklore traditions of many other cultures, where supernatural beings more frequently exist in simpler, more consistently adversarial relationships to humanity. There is also the question of why this particular figure, among Japan's many yokai, became so specifically and consistently associated not just with winter generally, but with the exact, extreme conditions found in Japan's heaviest snowfall regions specifically, rather than developing as a more geographically generalized seasonal spirit, the way certain other folklore figures examined in this series spread more broadly across entire countries or continents. Some researchers studying regional yokai distribution have suggested this specificity itself may be the most telling detail of all, evidence that Yuki-onna's tradition developed in direct, close conversation with the genuinely unique, almost otherworldly severity of snowfall found in these particular regions, a landscape harsh enough, isolating enough, and beautiful enough in its own dangerous way to require a spirit equally capable of embodying both qualities at once. Was Yuki-onna simply Japan's most narratively elaborate winter safety warning, her beauty and her lethal chill both serving the same underlying purpose of keeping travelers away from genuinely fatal conditions during the country's harshest storms. Or does her unusual emotional depth, her capacity across so many regional tellings for longing, loneliness, and even love, suggest something closer to what her more sympathetic tellings have always implied? That the coldest, most isolating landscapes in Japan needed a spirit capable of reflecting not just the physical danger of winter, but its particular, specific loneliness as well. The snow still falls as heavily across Niigata and Yamagata each winter as it did when these stories first took shape, and travelers moving alone through those mountain passes during the season's worst storms still, according to some who live there, keep a careful eye on the white, silent figures. The blizzard sometimes seems to conjure at the edge of visibility. Yuki-onna's danger arrives with a season, tied to snow, to storms, to the specific brutal geography of Japan's northern mountains. But some folklore figures aren't bound to weather or terrain at all. Some are bound to something far more fundamental, to death itself, and to the specific ancient dread of losing the one thing that has always been used to identify a person as who they are. We touched briefly, earlier in this exploration, on the older European folklore that helped shape America's Headless Horseman. Now, it's time to return to the source, to the original Irish tradition that predates Sleepy Hollow by centuries. This is the Dullahan. In Irish folklore, the Dullahan is described as a headless rider, mounted on a black horse whose eyes reportedly burn like embers, carrying his own severed head not tucked beneath an arm for convenience, but held aloft deliberately, using the head's own grotesquely enlarged, permanently grinning mouth to illuminate the dark road ahead like a gruesome lantern. Unlike the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow, whose menace, at least in Washington Irving's telling, is largely confined to chasing a single frightened schoolteacher through one specific valley, the Dullahan in traditional Irish folklore carries a far more universal and considerably darker function. He is a death omen, and specifically a herald, appearing wherever a death is imminent, whip in hand, sometimes described as fashioned from a human spine, driving a black coach called the Chupacabra, pulled by headless horses at terrifying speed through the Irish countryside at night. According to the traditional lore, the Dullahan doesn't simply announce death from a distance the way the Banshee's wail does. He actively seeks it out, riding directly to the home of the person about to die and calling out their name, at which point, according to the oldest versions of the tale, that person would immediately drop dead, whether from the sheer supernatural force of hearing their name spoken aloud by such a figure, or simply from the terror of the encounter itself. This detail places the Dullahan in a genuinely rare category among folklore death omens explored throughout this series. The Banshee warns. Families who hear her wail understand a death is coming, but retain, at least narratively, some remaining time before it arrives. The Dullahan, in most traditional tellings, doesn't warn at all. He arrives, and death follows immediately, collapsing the space between omen and event into a single, terrifying moment. Irish folk tradition attached several specific pieces of practical protective advice to encounters with the Dullahan, details that folklorists studying the legend find genuinely useful for understanding how deeply and specifically this belief was woven into everyday rural Irish life. Gold, according to the tradition, was believed to be the one substance the Dullahan feared, a detail some folklorists connect to broader Celtic and European traditions associating precious metals, particularly gold, with protective or purifying properties against various supernatural threats. A person who found themselves in the Dullahan's path was traditionally advised to display even a small piece of gold, sometimes said to be enough to drive the rider away entirely. Additionally, and unusually specifically for a folklore figure, several regional Irish traditions held that the Dullahan was somehow offended or repelled by witnesses watching his passage too openly, with some tellings describing the rider throwing a basin of blood over any onlooker bold or foolish enough to watch him ride by, marking that person, in certain versions, as the next to die. Written references to the Dullahan appear in Irish folklore collections dating back centuries, with the tradition documented extensively by 19th century Irish folklorists working during a period of intense national interest in preserving Irish oral tradition before industrialization, emigration, and, most devastatingly, the Great Famine of the 1840s dramatically reshaped rural Irish life and threatened to erode generations of orally transmitted folklore along with it. Scholars collecting Irish folk tales during this period, including figures working in the broader tradition later carried forward by writers like Lady Wilde and Douglas Hyde, recorded numerous regional variants of the Dullahan legend across different Irish counties, each carrying slightly different specific details about the coach, the whip, or the precise protective measures believed effective against him, while preserving the same essential core. A headless rider, his own grinning head held aloft as a lantern, arriving specifically and directly for the dying. The mainstream folkloric explanation for the Dullahan's development connects him to a broader, well-documented European tradition of headless rider and headless horseman folklore, a pattern found not just in Ireland but across Germany, England, and other parts of Northern Europe, likely rooted in some combination of pre-Christian beliefs about decapitation, sacrifice, and the specific supernatural danger historically associated with an incomplete or dishonored corpse. Some folklorists connect the tradition specifically to ancient Celtic reverence for the human head, a well-documented feature of pre-Christian Celtic culture across the British Isles and continental Europe, in which the head was considered the seat of the soul and a person's essential identity, sometimes preserved, displayed, or specifically venerated by Celtic warrior cultures in ways considerably more elaborate than most other parts of the human body received. If that connection holds, the Dullahan may represent one of the clearest surviving folkloric echoes of a genuinely ancient belief system, considerably predating Christianity's arrival in Ireland, reshaped over many centuries into the death omen tradition eventually recorded by 19th century folklorists. As for the specific, practical function the legend served in more recent centuries, folklorists studying rural Irish tradition note a familiar pattern by this point in our exploration. Death in pre-modern rural communities was frequent, often sudden, and rarely explainable through the medical understanding available at the time. A supernatural figure who called out the names of the dying, however terrifying, provided a narrative structure around loss that, paradoxically, may have offered some communities a strange form of comfort, transforming the genuine randomness and medical mystery of sudden death into something with at least the appearance of order, purpose, and a recognizable, if dreadful, cause. That explanation accounts for the Dullahan's broad cultural function, but it leaves certain specific details less than fully resolved. Folklorists have long puzzled over the unusually direct, almost mechanical role attributed to the Dullahan compared to related death omen figures examined elsewhere in this series. The Banshee wails but does not kill directly. The black dog appears as an omen but rarely causes death through the encounter itself. The Dullahan, by contrast, is consistently described across regional variants as an active agent of death rather than merely its herald, a distinction that raises a genuine question about why Irish tradition specifically produced a death omen figure with this uniquely direct causal power, when so many comparable folklore traditions across neighboring cultures maintained a clearer narrative separation between the warning and the death itself. There's also the detail of the gold, curiously specific and consistently repeated across regional variants collected by different folklorists working independently of one another in different Irish counties. Why gold specifically, rather than the iron, silver, or running water, more commonly cited as protective substances against supernatural threats elsewhere in European and British folklore, already examined throughout this series? Some researchers studying comparative Celtic folklore have proposed this detail may connect to older, only partially preserved beliefs about gold's specific ritual or spiritual significance in pre-Christian Irish culture. A thread that, like so much of Ireland's oldest oral tradition, was likely never fully written down before generations of transmission, famine, and emigration reshaped the culture that first told these stories. Was the Dullahan simply Ireland's regional variation on a broader European headless rider death omen tradition, his uniquely direct lethality a narrative intensification developed over centuries of oral retelling? Or does his specific, consistent details, the grinning lantern head, the gold that repels him, the direct power to call the dying by name, preserve something older and more precisely remembered than folklorists have yet been able to fully trace back to its original source? Ireland's rural roads at night remain, in places, as dark and as quiet as they were when these stories first took hold, and the oldest tellings never specified, with any real certainty, whether the Dullahan's ride was ever meant to end. The Dullahan belongs to a world of ancient roads and centuries-old oral tradition, his legend shaped by generations of retelling long before anyone thought to write it down. But not every entry in this exploration reaches back into the deep past. Some of the world's strangest folklore is remarkably young, born not in medieval Ireland or pre-colonial Japan, but within living memory, in the rural farmland of Puerto Rico, in a single year that changed how an entire hemisphere talked about the unexplained. This is the Chupacabra. Unlike nearly every legend examined throughout this exploration, the Chupacabra doesn't emerge from centuries of gradually accumulated oral tradition. Its origin can be traced to a remarkably specific place and time: Puerto Rico, in March of 1995, when livestock in the small town of Mocha began turning up dead under genuinely strange and disturbing circumstances. Farmers reported finding goats, and shortly after, a wider range of livestock, drained almost entirely of blood, with small precise puncture wounds discovered on the animals' necks, and, according to many of the earliest reports, no other visible signs of struggle, predation, or the kind of physical damage typically associated with a natural predator attack. Within weeks, similar reports began surfacing across other parts of Puerto Rico, and the name given to whatever was responsible drew directly from the specific nature of the attacks themselves: Chupacabra, roughly translating from Spanish as goat sucker. The initial wave of reports in 1995 coincided with, and was almost certainly amplified by, the first eyewitness description of the creature itself, provided by a Puerto Rican woman named Madeline Tolentino, who described encountering a strange, bipedal creature, roughly 3 to 4 feet tall, with grayish skin, large black eyes, a row of spikes running down its back, and an unusually strong, sulfurous odor. Tolentino's description, widely circulated through Puerto Rican media and quickly picked up by wire services and tabloid outlets across the Americas, became the foundational template for how the Chupacabra would be depicted for years afterward. And it's a detail folklorists and cryptozoology researchers alike consider genuinely significant. Unlike most legends explored throughout this series, where the earliest physical description has been lost to centuries of retelling, the Chupacabra's original primary eyewitness account exists on record, given by a named, identifiable individual within the same year the phenomenon first emerged. What followed was one of the fastest-spreading cryptid legends in recorded history, aided considerably by the era in which it emerged. Unlike the 1909 Jersey Devil Panic or the 1966 Mothman sightings, both of which spread primarily through print newspapers within relatively contained regional boundaries, the Chupacabra phenomenon developed during the early to mid-1990s, a period when satellite television, Spanish-language media networks with international reach, and the earliest stages of widespread internet use allowed the story to spread across Puerto Rico, into Mexico, and throughout Central and South America within a matter of months rather than years. By the late 1990s, Chupacabra livestock attacks were being reported not just in Puerto Rico, but across Mexico, Chile, Nicaragua, and eventually into parts of the southern United States, particularly Texas, with each region's reports carrying broadly similar core details. Livestock, most commonly goats, but eventually including chickens, dogs, and other animals, found drained of blood with small, precise puncture wounds and no clear evidence of a conventional predator attack. The mainstream scientific explanation for the vast majority of Chupacabra livestock attacks centers on a combination of misidentified natural predation and a genuine, documented medical condition affecting wild canines. Mange, caused by parasitic mites, is well documented in coyotes, foxes, and wild dogs across the Americas, and in severe advanced cases, produces exactly the kind of dramatic physical transformation that could plausibly account for eyewitness descriptions of a strange, hairless, alien-looking creature. Significant hair loss, thickened and darkened skin, emaciation severe enough to alter an animal's normal gait and posture, and a generally unfamiliar, unsettling silhouette compared to a healthy specimen of the same species. Numerous animals captured or found dead in regions reporting Chupacabra activity across Texas and northern Mexico in subsequent decades were confirmed through veterinary and genetic analysis to be coyotes suffering from severe mange, a finding widely reported by wildlife biologists and cited consistently as the most well-evidenced explanation for a significant portion of Chupacabra carcass discoveries in the years following the original 1995 Puerto Rico reports. As for the specific claim of blood-drained livestock with precise puncture wounds, veterinary researchers and wildlife biologists studying the phenomenon have offered a genuinely compelling, if less dramatic, natural explanation. Blood, after an animal's death, tends to pool and settle according to gravity in a process called livor mortis, and combined with normal post-mortem decomposition, this can create the visual appearance of a blood-drained carcass to an untrained observer, even when the animal's total blood volume hasn't actually been removed through any external means. Small, paired puncture wounds, meanwhile, are consistent with the bite pattern of common natural predators, particularly canines, whose canine teeth naturally create exactly this kind of wound pattern during a throat or neck attack, a detail that can appear far more mysterious and deliberate to a rural farmer discovering a dead animal than it would to a veterinarian conducting a formal necropsy. That combined explanation, mange-afflicted wild canines and natural post-mortem processes misinterpreted by frightened non-specialist witnesses, accounts for a substantial number of documented Chupacabra livestock cases, and has been directly confirmed through genetic testing in several specific, well-publicized instances across Texas and Mexico in subsequent years. But it doesn't fully address the original 1995 Puerto Rico reports and Tolentino's specific eyewitness description, which describe a creature bearing little physical resemblance to a mangy coyote at all, bipedal rather than quadrupedal, with distinctly different proportions, coloring, and behavior than any canine, healthy or diseased, would reasonably display. Skeptical researchers examining the original 1995 case have proposed alternative explanations for Tolentino's account specifically, including the possibility that her description was influenced, consciously or not, by a recently released science fiction horror film featuring an alien creature bearing a notable resemblance to her description, which had screened in Puerto Rico shortly before her reported encounter. A detail that some cryptozoology researchers consider a compelling case study in how popular media imagery can shape and inform genuine eyewitness testimony during a period of collective fear and uncertainty. Others studying the case have been more cautious about dismissing the original 1995 reports entirely, pointing out that the wave of livestock deaths in Puerto Rico that year was itself a well-documented, real agricultural phenomenon, regardless of what ultimately caused it, with veterinarians on the island at the time confirming genuine, unusual livestock losses across multiple farms within a compressed time frame, even if the specific cause was never definitively established through forensic investigation at the time. Whether that specific 1995 wave was ultimately caused by an unusually aggressive population of disease-afflicted wild predators, a still unidentified natural cause, or some combination of genuine agricultural crisis and rapidly spreading media-amplified panic, remains a question without full resolution, distinct from the broader mange-related explanation that accounts for many of the creature's later geographically scattered sightings. The Chupacabra's remarkably short history, compared to nearly every other legend explored in this series, offers something genuinely unique: the rare opportunity to study a folklore phenomenon from its very first documented moment, tracing in real time exactly how a specific agricultural crisis, a single detailed eyewitness account, and the accelerating media technology of the 1990s combined to create, within a matter of months, a cryptid legend that would go on to become one of the most recognized in the entire Western Hemisphere. Was the Chupacabra simply a modern folklore phenomenon born from a genuine, if ultimately misunderstood, wave of predator attacks, its most famous physical description shaped by a frightened witness's memory, colliding with a recently viewed horror film, amplified by media technology fast enough to spread the story across an entire hemisphere within months rather than centuries? Or does the specific, well-documented agricultural crisis that struck Puerto Rico in early 1995, still not fully explained through forensic evidence collected at the time, suggest that something genuinely unusual was happening on that island before the legend ever had a name attached to it at all? 3 decades later, livestock deaths bearing the Chupacabra's signature are still occasionally reported across Latin America and the southern United States, each new case reopening the same unresolved question that has followed the legend since its very first year. How much of this was ever really about the creature at all, and how much was always about the very real, very frightened farmers who first found their animals dead in the field? The Chupacabra's story unfolded in real time, traceable to a single farm, a single year, a single named witness. But travel back across the world to the villages and plantations of maritime Southeast Asia, and you'll find a legend built from the opposite material entirely. Centuries of quiet, deeply felt oral tradition, wrapped around one of the oldest and most universally painful realities any community has ever had to face: the death of a mother and the child she never got to raise. This is the Pontianak. Found in various forms across Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and Brunei, the Pontianak, sometimes called kuntilanak in Indonesian tradition, is among the most widely feared and consistently described supernatural figures in maritime Southeast Asian folklore. She is described, across an enormous span of regional variation, as the vengeful ghost of a woman who died during pregnancy or childbirth, or, in some tellings, shortly after giving birth. Her death and the devastating loss of her expected child fusing into a single, unresolved source of supernatural rage. In her true form, tradition holds she appears with long black hair, pale white or ashen skin, and long fingernails, often wearing a white or occasionally blood-stained dress. But her more dangerous and consistently reported ability, across virtually every regional variant of the legend, is her capacity to disguise herself as a strikingly beautiful young woman, luring men, particularly at night, before revealing her true, horrifying nature, often at the last possible moment when escape has become far more difficult. One of the most consistently reported details across the Pontianak tradition, and one that folklorists studying the legend find genuinely significant, involves scent and sound rather than sight. Traditional accounts across multiple countries describe the Pontianak's approach being signaled by the fragrance of frangipani flowers, a scent widely associated across the region with cemeteries and funerary rites, and by a distinctive baby's cry said to grow fainter as the Pontianak draws closer and louder as she moves away, a deliberate inversion of ordinary auditory expectation designed, according to the folklore, to disorient and mislead anyone attempting to judge her actual proximity or plan an escape. This detail, folklore researchers note, distinguishes the Pontianak from many other vengeful female ghost figures found across world folklore traditions, who typically rely primarily on visual horror or direct physical encounter, rather than this specific, deliberately misleading sensory signature. The Pontianak's folklore is documented extensively across Malay language oral tradition and colonial-era written accounts dating back well over a century, with British and Dutch colonial administrators and missionaries operating throughout maritime Southeast Asia in the 19th and early 20th centuries, recording local beliefs about the figure as part of broader ethnographic documentation of regional folk religion. What emerges from this documentation, and from the extensive body of oral tradition that predates and extends well beyond it, is a legend deeply, specifically tied to the genuine historical dangers of pregnancy and childbirth across the region prior to the development of modern obstetric medicine. Maternal mortality during childbirth was, for centuries, a devastatingly common reality across Southeast Asia, as it was across nearly every pre-modern society examined throughout world history, with death during delivery or from complications shortly afterward representing one of the leading causes of death for women of childbearing age well into the 20th century in many rural regions of the area. Traditional communities across Malaysia and Indonesia developed extensive, specific funerary practices explicitly designed to prevent a woman who died during pregnancy or childbirth from returning as a Pontianak. A detail folklorists consider genuinely revealing about how seriously and specifically this belief-shaped actual community behavior, rather than existing purely as a passive cautionary story. Documented traditional practices in various regions included placing specific items in the coffin, such as eggs or needles, believed to prevent the deceased woman's spirit from rising, and, in some more elaborate regional traditions, driving a nail into the back of the deceased woman's neck, a practice specifically intended to prevent her transformation, reflecting a genuinely widespread and deeply held belief that such deaths carried a real, active, supernatural risk, requiring direct, deliberate ritual intervention rather than simple mourning alone. The mainstream folkloric and anthropological explanation for the Pontianak's development follows a pattern that will, by this point in our exploration, feel familiar, while carrying its own regionally specific weight. Death during childbirth represented a genuine, statistically significant tragedy across the communities where this legend developed, one that combined profound grief with the specific, culturally resonant loss of a life that had never fully begun. Anthropologists studying comparable folklore traditions across multiple cultures have noted that figures representing the vengeful spirits of women who died in childbirth appear with notable frequency across numerous, historically unconnected societies worldwide, a pattern some researchers attribute to the near-universal human experience of maternal mortality prior to modern medicine, and the intense, complicated grief such deaths generated within communities forced to process the loss of both mother and child simultaneously. The Pontianak's dual nature, capable of horrifying violence but rooted in a fundamentally sympathetic tragedy, mirrors thematic elements found in La Llorona's story earlier in this exploration, another figure whose supernatural danger is inseparable from maternal loss and grief, despite the two legends developing entirely independently on opposite sides of the world. That broader anthropological framework accounts for the emotional and cultural logic underlying the Pontianak's origin, but it doesn't fully address certain specific, remarkably consistent details that recur across the legend's extensive geographic range. The frangipani scent and inverted baby's cry auditory signature appear with striking consistency across Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and Brunei, regions with distinct languages, colonial histories, and religious traditions, ranging from predominantly Muslim communities in Malaysia and Indonesia to more religiously diverse populations in Singapore, raising a genuine question for folklorists about how such specific sensory details achieved and maintained this level of consistency across such considerable cultural and geographic distance, particularly in an era well before the kind of rapid, mass media transmission that helped spread more recent legends like the Chupacabra within a matter of months rather than centuries. Some researchers studying the tradition's regional consistency point to the historically extensive maritime trade networks that connected coastal communities across the Malay archipelago for well over 1,000 years, long before European colonization, as a plausible mechanism for the gradual, organic spread and cross-pollination of specific folkloric details between otherwise geographically separated communities, similar to how trade and migration are understood to have shaped folklore transmission across other regions examined throughout this series. Others have proposed a more localized explanation, suggesting the specific sensory details may reflect genuine, shared cultural associations between frangipani flowers and death across the broader region, given the flower's well-documented historical use in funerary contexts across multiple Southeast Asian cultures, independent of the Pontianak legend specifically, providing a plausible cultural anchor point around which the broader supernatural tradition could have developed with unusual consistency, even across communities with limited direct historical contact with one another. Was the Pontianak simply maritime Southeast Asia's regionally specific expression of a genuinely global folkloric pattern, communities across the world independently transforming the profound, universal grief of maternal death into a vengeful supernatural figure? Her specific details shaped by centuries of trade, migration, and shared cultural symbolism across the Malay archipelago? Or does the remarkable consistency of her most distinctive sensory signature, that particular flower, that inverted cry, recurring with such precision across such a wide and culturally varied region, suggest something more deeply and specifically shared than trade routes and funerary symbolism alone can fully explain? Frangipani trees still bloom across cemeteries and gardens throughout Malaysia and Indonesia today, their fragrance considered, by many who live there still, worth noticing carefully after dark. The Pontianak's tragedy is singular, tied to one woman, one loss, one specific and devastating death. But travel further into the folklore of the Philippine archipelago, and you'll encounter something considerably broader and more difficult to pin down entirely. Not one specific figure with one specific origin, but an entire sprawling category of shape-shifting predator, so deeply embedded in Filipino culture that entire regions of the country still organize their understanding of nighttime danger around a single unifying word. This is the Aswang. Unlike most of the figures explored throughout this series, the Aswang isn't one single, consistently described creature, but rather an umbrella term covering a genuinely wide range of related shape-shifting, predatory beings found throughout Filipino folklore, with significant regional variation across the archipelago's more than 7,000 islands. Depending on the region and the specific storyteller, an aswang might be described as a vampire-like creature that feeds on blood, a ghoul that exhumes and consumes corpses from freshly dug graves, a witch capable of causing illness or death through curses, or, in one of the tradition's most distinctive and widely feared forms, a manananggo, a creature able to physically separate its upper torso from its lower body, sprouting bat-like wings and flying through the night sky in search of victims, its severed lower half left standing motionless and vulnerable back at home until its return before dawn. What unites the Aswang tradition's many regional variants, despite their considerable differences in specific ability and appearance, is a consistent set of underlying themes: deception, concealment, and the deeply unsettling possibility that an aswang might be living undetected within one's own community, appearing by day as an entirely ordinary neighbor, relative, or even family member. This detail, folklorists studying the tradition consistently emphasize, is central to understanding why the Aswang legend developed such powerful, sustained cultural force across the Philippines, compared to folklore figures more clearly and safely confined to remote wilderness or specific haunted locations. The danger of the aswang was never distant. It was, according to the tradition, potentially standing right beside you. The aswang's documented history reaches back to some of the earliest written records of Filipino culture available to historians, with 16th and 17th century Spanish colonial chroniclers, arriving as missionaries and administrators following the beginning of Spanish colonization of the Philippines in 1565, recording detailed accounts of pre-existing local beliefs about aswang-like creatures, describing them as already deeply established within indigenous Filipino spiritual and folk medicine traditions well before European contact. This colonial documentation, while filtered inevitably through the cultural assumptions and religious agenda of the chroniclers recording it, provides historians with an unusually early written record for a folklore tradition originating outside of European written culture, offering genuine insight into how deeply rooted aswang belief already was at the very beginning of the documented historical record for the region. That colonial history, however, also produced one of the more genuinely troubling chapters connected to the aswang legend. One folklorists and historians studying the tradition consider essential context rather than a peripheral detail. Throughout the Spanish colonial period and well beyond it, accusations of being an aswang, particularly the witch-like variant of the belief, were sometimes directed at real, specific individuals within Filipino communities, predominantly women, particularly elderly women, midwives, and those who lived somewhat apart from mainstream community life, whether through choice, circumstance, or simple social isolation. Historical records document real cases of social ostracism, violence, and, in some documented instances, killings carried out against individuals accused of being aswang, a pattern historians studying the phenomenon have noted bears genuine, uncomfortable resemblance to witch persecution patterns documented across numerous other cultures worldwide, including the European witch trials of the early modern period, where existing supernatural belief systems became weaponized against specific, often already vulnerable individuals within a community, frequently along clear lines of gender, age, and social marginalization. This darker historical dimension complicates any purely folkloric reading of the aswang tradition, and modern Filipino historians and anthropologists studying the legend have increasingly emphasized this uncomfortable history alongside the more straightforwardly supernatural elements of the story, arguing that understanding the aswang requires reckoning honestly with how deeply real, documented human suffering became entangled with the folklore over centuries. a pattern of accusation and violence that, troublingly, has not been confined entirely to the distant past, with isolated incidents connected to Aswang-related accusations and fear still occasionally reported in more remote rural areas of the Philippines, even within recent decades. The mainstream anthropological explanation for the Aswang tradition's broader development draws on several patterns already established throughout this series. The Philippines' geography, an archipelago of thousands of islands with historically limited infrastructure connecting many rural and remote communities, created conditions where local folk beliefs could develop with considerable regional specificity, while still sharing underlying thematic structure, not unlike the highly localized Kelpie traditions of Scotland examined earlier in this exploration. The specific fear of concealment and community infiltration central to Aswang belief, meanwhile, aligns with a broader anthropological pattern folklorists have identified across numerous cultures. Societies facing genuine uncertainty about illness, death, or misfortune, particularly before the development of modern medical understanding, frequently developed supernatural explanations that located danger within the community itself rather than purely in the external wilderness. A pattern that, while offering communities a framework for understanding otherwise inexplicable suffering, carried the genuine, well-documented risk of that framework eventually being turned against real, vulnerable individuals. That explanation accounts for a great deal of the Aswang's cultural function and its troubling historical application, but it leaves certain specific narrative details, particularly the Manananggal's uniquely visceral, physically impossible method of self-division, less fully addressed by a purely social or medical anxiety framework alone. Folklorists studying comparative Southeast Asian folklore have noted related self-severing creature traditions appearing in the folklore of neighboring regions, including certain Malaysian and Indonesian traditions with conceptual similarities to the Manananggal, raising questions about whether this specific anatomically extreme narrative detail reflects independent cultural development across the region, or a shared, considerably older folkloric root reaching back before the more recent, better documented colonial-era historical record available to researchers today. There's also the matter of the tradition's remarkable adaptability and continued cultural presence, considerably more sustained into the present day than several other legends examined throughout this series. Aswang folklore remains an active, frequently referenced part of contemporary Filipino popular culture, appearing regularly in modern Filipino film, television, and literature, and surveys of belief in various regions of the Philippines, particularly rural provincial areas, continue to find a meaningful percentage of the population expressing genuine, non-ironic belief in the possibility of Aswang activity within their own communities, a level of sustained, contemporary belief considerably higher than most other folklore traditions examined in this exploration currently maintain in their regions of origin. Was the Aswang simply the Philippines' regionally varied expression of a broader, worldwide pattern connecting community, anxiety, illness, and death to internal supernatural threat? A pattern that, like comparable witch belief traditions elsewhere in the world, tragically came to endanger real, vulnerable individuals across centuries of documented history. Or does the tradition's remarkable diversity, its deep pre-colonial roots, and its unusually sustained presence in contemporary Filipino belief and culture suggest something considerably more complex than a single explanatory framework can fully capture? A folklore tradition still actively, presently shaping how communities across thousands of islands understand the difference between a trusted neighbor and something considerably more dangerous wearing the same face. Across the Philippines today, in provinces both remote and urbanized, the Aswang remains, for many, not simply an old story passed down from a more superstitious past, but a living, present possibility, one still worth watching for carefully after the sun goes down. The Aswang's danger hides behind a familiar face, a threat the community itself might unknowingly harbor. Ireland and Scotland developed a related but distinct anxiety of their own. Not about a neighbor secretly being something monstrous, but about a neighbor, a spouse, or a child being quietly taken and replaced entirely, their true selves spirited away into a world existing just alongside our own, separated by little more than a hillside, a ring of mushrooms, or the wrong whore of the night. This is the world of the Celtic fairy folk. It's worth clarifying immediately what this tradition actually describes, because centuries of later, softened retelling have left most modern audiences with an image entirely disconnected from the original folklore. The fairies of genuine Celtic tradition, known across various regions and languages as the AOC, the CD, or simply the good people, a deliberately respectful, even fearful euphemism used specifically to avoid drawing their attention, bear almost no resemblance to the small, benevolent, winged creatures popularized by later children's literature and entertainment. In the original Irish, Scottish, and broader Celtic tradition, the fairy folk were understood as a powerful, often dangerous, and fundamentally alien race, generally human-sized or larger, associated with specific ancient landscape features, particularly the raised earthen mounds found scattered across the Irish and Scottish countryside. Structures now understood by archaeologists to be genuine Neolithic and Bronze Age burial sites and ceremonial structures, predating the folklore attached to them by thousands of years. This connection between fairy folklore and genuine prehistoric archaeology is one of the most historically significant details in the entire tradition. The mounds specifically associated with fairy activity across Ireland, sites like Newgrange and countless smaller, less famous examples scattered across the countryside, are real, extensively studied archaeological structures, some dating back over 5,000 years, considerably predating Ireland's written historical record and the arrival of Christianity by millennia. Archaeologists and folklorists studying the connection generally agree that later Celtic communities, encountering these clearly ancient, clearly constructed, but culturally unexplained structures, developed a folklore tradition specifically to account for their mysterious origin and purpose, populating them with a powerful, otherworldly race, understood to have either built them, inhabited them, or continued to dwell within them long after the structure's original builders had been forgotten entirely. In this sense, fairy folklore functions almost as an inherited, garbled cultural memory, an attempt by later generations to make sense of a landscape shaped by ancestors whose actual identity and purpose had been lost to time. The genuine folklore surrounding the fairy folk carried real, specific danger, expressed through an extensive body of protective customs and practical advice passed down across generations of rural Irish and Scottish communities. Certain nights, particularly the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain, roughly corresponding to the end of October and understood as a time when the boundary between the human world and the fairy realm grew especially thin, were considered particularly dangerous for encountering fairy activity. Specific locations, especially fairy mounds, or raths, and certain trees, particularly hawthorn trees found standing alone in open fields, were widely believed to be fairy property, and disturbing them, whether through construction, farming, or simple physical damage, was believed to invite serious supernatural retribution. Historical records document real, practical consequences of this belief well into the 20th century, including documented cases of road construction projects in rural Ireland being deliberately rerouted around individual hawthorn trees, specifically to avoid disturbing suspected fairy territory. A detail that illustrates just how seriously and practically this belief system continued to shape real decision-making long after most of Europe had modernized. Central to the darker dimension of fairy folklore is the changeling belief, among the most consistently documented and, in certain historical cases, genuinely tragic aspects of the entire tradition. According to widespread Celtic folk belief, fairies were understood to sometimes steal human infants, or occasionally adults, particularly new mothers, replacing them with a changeling, a fairy being disguised to resemble the stolen person but lacking their true nature, often identified within the folklore through supposedly telling signs: persistent illness, unusual behavior, failure to thrive, or a sudden, unexplained personality change. This belief, tragically, extended well beyond simple folk story into real, documented historical consequence. The most infamous and thoroughly documented case involves Bridget Cleary, a young married woman in rural County Tipperary, Ireland, who died in March 1895 after her husband and several family members, convinced she had been replaced by a changeling following a period of illness, subjected her to various folk rituals intended to drive out the fairy imposter and force the return of the real Bridget. The case resulted in her death and a subsequent, extensively covered criminal trial, with her husband ultimately convicted of manslaughter, and it remains to this day one of the most well-documented instances in modern European history of traditional folk belief directly resulting in a real fatality, covered extensively by contemporary newspapers and later examined in considerable historical and academic detail. The mainstream historical and anthropological explanation for changeling belief specifically, and for fairy folklore's broader protective function, follows a pattern examined several times throughout this series, though with a particularly well-documented medical dimension in this case. Historians and medical researchers studying documented changeling cases across Ireland, Scotland, and other regions with similar folklore traditions have noted that many recorded changeling accusations align closely with symptoms of genuine, but at the time poorly understood, medical and developmental conditions, including various congenital disorders, autism spectrum presentations, and other conditions affecting infant and child development in ways that pre-modern communities, lacking any framework of modern pediatric or neurological medicine, would have found genuinely inexplicable and frightening. Bridget Cleary's own case, tragically, involved documented physical illness, quite possibly bronchitis or a related respiratory condition, providing a stark, real-world example of how a genuine, treatable medical situation could become catastrophically reinterpreted through an existing folk belief system with lethal consequences. That medical and psychological explanation accounts for a great deal of changeling folklore's tragic real-world application, but it addresses only one dimension of a considerably broader fairy tradition, one that folklorists studying its full scope find harder to reduce entirely to misunderstood illness alone. The consistent, specific association between fairy folklore and genuinely ancient, archaeologically verified prehistoric structures remains a detail that continues to intrigue researchers precisely because it demonstrates folklore functioning as a kind of unintentional historical preservation, later generations correctly identifying these locations as significant, ancient, and connected to a vanished culture, even while completely misunderstanding the actual nature of that connection. Some archaeologists and folklorists studying the phenomenon across multiple countries have noted a broader pattern worth sitting with. Sites later folklore identifies as supernaturally significant frequently do correspond to genuine prehistoric ceremonial or burial activity, a correlation whose ultimate explanation, whether coincidental site selection based on shared aesthetic or geographic preferences across millennia, some form of genuinely preserved oral memory reaching back further than historians generally consider possible, or something else entirely, remains a genuinely open question within the field. Was Celtic fairy folklore simply an elaborate cultural framework, built to explain a mysterious, ancient landscape, and process the genuine, otherwise inexplicable tragedy of childhood illness and developmental difference in an era before modern medicine, one that occasionally, catastrophically turned real and lethal when applied to cases like Bridget Cleary's? Or does the tradition's remarkable specificity, its consistent attachment to genuinely ancient, verifiable archaeological sites across an enormous span of Irish and Scottish geography, suggest that later generations were responding to something real about those particular places, even while completely losing the original context that made them significant in the first place? The mounds are still there, still quietly scattered across the Irish and Scottish countryside, still occasionally, even now, left undisturbed by builders and farmers who couldn't fully explain why, exactly, they preferred not to test the old stories after all. The fairy mounds of Ireland and Scotland carry a genuine ancient danger, a threat that demanded careful avoidance and specific protective ritual. But not every spirit belonging to that same broader Celtic and British folkloric tradition was something to be feared and kept at a distance. Tucked into the same farmhouses and cottages where families told their children to stay away from the hawthorn trees and the fairy mounds, another kind of household spirit was, according to a very different strand of the same folk tradition, already quietly living among them and had been for generations. This is the Brownie, found predominantly in Scottish and English folklore, with closely related counterparts appearing across other Northern European traditions. The Brownie occupies a genuinely unusual position among the supernatural figures examined throughout this exploration. A household spirit understood, according to consistent tradition, to be fundamentally helpful rather than threatening, so long as it was treated with the correct, specific etiquette. Traditional descriptions depict the Brownie as a small, wizened, hairy, humanoid figure, typically described as somewhat unkempt in appearance, said to inhabit a specific household or farm and perform useful domestic labor overnight while the family slept. Tasks like sweeping floors, tending to livestock, threshing grain, or completing unfinished farm chores, all carried out silently and without ever being directly observed in the act, in exchange for nothing more than a small, specific offering. Most commonly, a bowl of cream or fresh milk, left out for it near the hearth before the household retired for the night. What makes the Brownie tradition genuinely distinctive within this broader exploration of folklore is the almost contractual precision governing the relationship between the spirit and the human household it served. Across an extensive body of collected Scottish and English folklore, one rule recurs with remarkable, near-universal consistency. A Brownie could never be directly thanked, paid, or given any gift of clothing under any circumstances without immediately and permanently driving the spirit away. Offended by what the tradition consistently frames not as generosity, but as an insult, treating what the Brownie understood as a voluntary, ongoing relationship as though it were common, transactional servant's labor. Numerous specific regional tales collected by 19th-century folklorists describe well-meaning, but ultimately careless households losing a beloved, helpful Brownie precisely because a family member, out of genuine gratitude, left out a new set of clothes or spoke direct words of thanks, only to watch their household's supernatural helper vanish permanently that same night, sometimes accompanied, according to certain regional variants, by a final, mournful lament heard echoing from the property as the spirit departed for good. This specific, consistent detail, the precise etiquette required to maintain a Brownie's goodwill, and the equally precise mistakes capable of losing it permanently, is significant to folklorists studying the tradition for reasons that extend well beyond simple narrative color. Unlike many folklore figures whose behavior across regional variants shifts considerably from telling to telling, the Brownie's rules of engagement remained remarkably stable across an enormous geographic range, from the Scottish Highlands and Lowlands down through northern England, suggesting a genuinely deep, widely shared cultural understanding of exactly how this particular relationship was meant to function, one apparently important enough to preserve with unusual precision across generations of oral retelling. Written references to Brownie folklore appear as early as the 16th century in Scottish and English sources, with the tradition documented extensively by later folklorists and antiquarians, including significant collection work carried out well into the 19th century across rural farming communities where belief in household spirits, brownies among them, remained a meaningful, actively maintained part of daily domestic practice considerably longer than in more urbanized regions of Britain. Historical accounts describe specific real households and even specific named farms across Scotland and northern England maintaining consistent generational traditions of leaving out cream for their resident brownie, a practice some families reportedly continued as an established household custom well into the 19th century, regardless of how literally each individual family member understood or believed in the tradition's supernatural claims. The mainstream folkloric and anthropological explanation for the brownie tradition's development and remarkable persistence centers on its genuine practical utility within pre-modern agricultural households. Farm labor across historical rural Scotland and England was demanding, constant, and never fully completed by the time a household retired each night. And folklorists studying comparable household spirit traditions across Northern Europe, including related figures like the Scandinavian Tomt or Nisa, have proposed that these traditions may have served several overlapping practical functions simultaneously, encouraging children and younger household members toward tidiness and completed chores through the implicit threat of an unseen, judgmental observer, providing psychological comfort and a sense of order within households facing the genuine unpredictability of pre-modern agricultural life, and offering families a culturally acceptable explanation for small domestic mysteries, misplaced tools mysteriously returned, minor chores unexpectedly completed that might otherwise have gone unexplained. The specific etiquette rules governing payment and gratitude, meanwhile, align with a broader pattern folklorists have identified across numerous unrelated household spirit traditions worldwide, in which supernatural domestic helpers consistently require precise, culturally specific ritual treatment. A pattern some researchers suggest reflects deeper cultural anxieties about labor, obligation, and the delicate, easily disrupted balance of reciprocal relationships within tightly knit rural communities. That explanation accounts for a great deal of the brownie's practical cultural function, but it doesn't fully address the specific, remarkably consistent narrative detail of the departing lament, described across multiple independently collected regional accounts as an audible, mournful sound accompanying a brownie's permanent departure after an accidental insult. Folklorists studying the tradition have found this detail difficult to fully explain through a purely practical, labor-encouraging framework alone, since a story intended primarily to encourage careful, respectful household behavior doesn't obviously require this specific, emotionally resonant closing detail to achieve its cautionary purpose. Some researchers have proposed that this element reflects a genuine emotional dimension embedded within the broader tradition, communities forming a real, if entirely one-sided and culturally constructed, sense of ongoing relationship and even attachment to their household's particular brownie across years or generations of tradition, making its loss, however narratively constructed, feel like an authentic, mournful departure rather than a simple cautionary consequence. There's also the broader question, one that connects the brownie tradition back to several other legends already examined throughout this exploration, of why such strikingly similar helpful household spirit traditions developed independently across so many culturally distinct regions of Northern Europe, from Scotland's brownies to Scandinavia's Tomt and Nisa, to comparable figures found in German and other Northern and Central European folk traditions, each maintaining broadly similar core rules around required offerings, forbidden gratitude, and the real risk of losing a helpful spirit through well-intentioned but ultimately incorrect treatment. Some folklorists argue this widespread pattern reflects nothing more than the shared practical realities of pre-modern Northern European agricultural life, naturally producing similar cultural solutions across separate but comparably structured societies. Others, studying the deeper comparative mythology connecting these traditions, have raised the more speculative possibility that this consistent pattern points toward a genuinely shared, considerably older root belief system reaching back further into pre-Christian Northern European tradition than the currently available written historical record can fully trace or confirm. Was the Brownie simply rural Scotland and England's practical folkloric solution to the genuine, unending demands of pre-modern farm labor? A household spirit whose precise rules of etiquette encouraged careful, respectful behavior while offering families a comforting explanation for small domestic mysteries? Or does the tradition's remarkable consistency across such a wide geographic range and its close conceptual kinship with comparable household spirits found across so much of Northern Europe suggest these communities were independently, or perhaps not so independently, drawing on something older and more deeply shared than agricultural convenience alone can fully account for? Old farmhouses across Scotland and northern England still stand, some maintained by families who no longer remember exactly why a particular corner near the hearth was once kept especially tidy, or why, for reasons never fully explained, a small bowl of cream was, for so many generations, never quite the same thing as an ordinary evening chore.